In 1849, in the ruins of the Palace Library at Nineveh, in the north of what is now Iraq, a British excavation pulled a broken clay tablet out of the burned debris. It was one of thousands. It was catalogued, crated, shipped to London, and it sat, largely unread, for the better part of a century, because what was written on it did not look like history or like poetry. It looked like a list, and the list was about human skin. If there is a mole on the right side of a man's forehead, it said, then this will follow. If the mark is on the left, then something else. If it is red rather than dark, if it lies above the eye or below it, if it appears on the neck, on the breast, on the palm, on the sole of the foot, line after line after line, a systematic catalog of the marks a human body can carry, and for each one, a reading of what that mark meant about the person carrying it. Stop for a moment and do the thing the tablet is asking you to do, because you can. Turn your left hand over and look at the palm, and then look at the inside of your forearm. Almost all of you will find something. A mole, a freckle you have had since childhood, a small pale scar whose story you have forgotten, a birthmark you were told about, but never thought about again. Some of you are looking at a mark right now that has been on your body since before you had language to ask about it. 4,000 years ago, there was an entire profession of men whose job was to read that mark, and a standardized, edited, multi-tablet reference work that told them how. That work has a name. The Babylonians called it the Alamdimu, and in the Standard Modern Edition, prepared by the scholar Barbara Bach and published in 2000, it runs to something like 27 tablets. It is not folklore, and it was not fringe. It was a technical series held in royal libraries, copied by trained scribes, and its standardization is credited to a named man, a scholar called Esagil Keen Apli, who worked for the Babylonian court around the 11th century before our era. He is the same man credited with editing the Great Diagnostic Handbook of Mesopotamian Medicine. The person who organized how they read illness is the person who organized how they read your skin. To them, those were the same discipline, and here is what makes this worth 3 hours of your evening. We think of that as superstition, and much of it was. But strip the theology out and look at the claim underneath. And the claim is this, that the surface of the human body is not decoration, that it is an inscribed surface, that marks appear on it which the person did not choose, cannot explain, and did not inherit from either parent, and that those marks are legible, that they carry information about what happened to that body and what will happen to it. And that specific claim, the claim they built a 27-tablet reference work around, is one that modern medicine has quietly, and without ever using their language, proved correct in more places than is comfortable. 12 things the Mesopotamians wrote about the marks on your body, laid one at a time against what has actually been measured, with the name of the tablet series, the name of the scholar who edited it, and the year said out loud every time. 3 of the 12 are places where the modern science is genuinely contested, and on those I will hand the microphone to the skeptics before I say a word in my own favor. One of the 12 I'm going to debunk myself, on purpose, because it is nonsense and you should hear me say so. And the 9th is the one that changed how I look at my own arm, because the 9th is a mark that a substantial number of people carry, and it is not inherited from your mother, and it is not inherited from your father, and modern genetics has worked out exactly where it comes from, and the answer is stranger than the omen. They wrote it on the body, and the body is still carrying it. Before the first of the 12, you need to know exactly what we are working from, and you need the mainstream position at full strength, because everything tonight stands on real published tablet series and real published studies, and I hold both of them to the same standard. Start with the corpus, because the single fastest way to lose you would be to wave at ancient texts without telling you which ones. There are 4 bodies of writing behind this video, and I am going to name all 4 now, with their editors, so that you can go and check me. The first is the Alamdimu, the physiognomic omen series, the one that reads the shape and marks of the body. 27 tablets or thereabouts in the standard reconstruction. The modern critical edition is Barbara Bach's, published in 2000. Inside that series sit named subsections, and I will use their names as we go, because they are how the ancient scholars themselves divided the subject. The Shuma Liptu is the part about skin marks, the moles, and the discolorations. The Nigdim Dimu deals with the build and the features. The Karadugu deals with the manner of speech. They divided the readable body into departments the way a modern hospital divides itself into departments. The second is the Nabnitu, a Sumerian and Akkadian lexical series, which is essentially a systematic vocabulary of the human body and its forms, part of the enormous scribal apparatus for organizing knowledge into lists. The third is the Shuma Izbu, 24 tablets on anomalous births, edited by Erla Leichty in 1970 and treated more recently by Nikla Dezorzi. This is a difficult text, and I will handle it carefully when we reach it, because it deals with infants born with visible differences, and I'm not going to be flippant about that. And the fourth is the Sakiku, sometimes written SA.GIG, the Great Diagnostic Handbook, 40 tablets, edited by Niels Hiesel in 2000, and treated at length by Joanne Scurlock. That one is medicine proper, and its editorship is credited to the same Esagilkin Opli. It is where the phrase you will hear repeatedly comes from, the hand of a god, Quat Eli, their way of naming which power had touched a body. 4 real series, 4 named modern editors, 4 dates. If I say something tonight that is not in one of those, or in W.G. Lambert's work, or in Dandamaev's, I will tell you it is my inference and not their text. Now, the mainstream explanation, and I give it its full weight, because it is strong, and it is largely right. A scholar of Mesopotamia will tell you that omen literature is the natural output of a civilization that believed the gods communicated through the world, rather than through scripture, and that had discovered the power of the systematic list. They listed everything. They listed the behavior of oil poured on water, the shapes of animal livers, the movements of planets, the appearance of a newborn, the marks on a man's skin, and they listed them in the same if-then grammar every time, because that grammar was their technology for turning observation into a consultable reference. On this reading, the skin omens are not a discovery about human biology. They are pattern matching in a culture with no concept of statistical correlation, generating an enormous catalog of coincidences, preserved because scribes copied what scribes before them had copied. That is the sober account, and I accept it. I am not going to tell you a Babylonian could read your future off your forearm. The argument tonight is narrower, and, I think, harder to dismiss. It is that the underlying premise, that the body's surface is an inscribed and legible record rather than a blank, has held up. Not the readings, the premise, and it has held up in places that would have astonished them. They said the count and the position of the marks matters, and a 2005 meta-analysis in the European Journal of Cancer by Gandini and colleagues established that the total number of moles on a person is the single strongest predictor we have for one particular cancer. They said the marks on the hand are laid down before you are anyone, and a 2023 paper in the journal Cell by Ho, Zhang, Glover, and colleagues worked out the actual genetic machinery that lays down your fingerprints between the 10th and the 16th week in the womb, after which it is fixed for the rest of your life. They said some marks come from no parent at all, and modern genetics has found exactly such marks and named the mechanism. They had no microscope and no statistics. They had an if-then list and a very long time to watch people. So we go through it in order, 12 of them, from the invention of reading a body all the way to a map that is on every single person listening, including you, that you will never see. For each one, the tablet series by name, the editor and year, the mainstream explanation at full strength, and then the measurement. 3 of them are genuinely contested in the modern literature, and I will hand the skeptics the microphone on those out loud. One of them I am going to knock down myself, because it is a modern fraud that dresses itself in this material, and you deserve to hear me say so before someone sells it to you. If you have ever been asked about a mark on your body and had no answer, this one was made for you. Take 1 second and subscribe, because a slow, careful 3 hours, does not travel on its own, and the machine buries it. And the rest of this series will not reach you otherwise. And stay with me, because the first one is about the moment a civilization stopped seeing a body and started reading one, and about the fact that we have just started doing it again with machines. They wrote it on the body, and the body is still carrying it. Put your hand flat against your own face for a moment, not to cover it, just to feel it. Feel the ridge of the brow, the width of the jaw under the skin, the small asymmetry that every human face has, and that you have stopped noticing in your own, because you have looked at it every day of your life. That face has already been read tonight, probably more than once. Not by a person, by a machine. And the first thing on this list is the moment a civilization invented the idea that made that possible. The idea that a human surface is not a surface at all, but a document, and that a trained man with the right list in front of him can sit down and read you the way another man reads a contract. The series is called the Alam Dimu, which is said Alam Dimmu. In the standard reconstruction, it runs to roughly 27 tablets. The critical edition, the scholarly edition that put the fragments in order and gave the modern world a text it could actually work from, was produced by Barbara Bach and published in the year 2000. If you take one name away from this item, take hers. Because almost everything anyone says in English about Mesopotamian physiognomy stands on that edition. Its standardization, the shaping of scattered local traditions into one long fixed sequence, is credited to a scholar named Esagil Kin Apli, said Asa Gil Kin Ap Lee, working in the 11th century before the Common Era. Credited to. I want to be exact about that word. The attribution comes to us through the later tradition, through catalog texts that name him as the editor. It is entirely plausible. It is not a receipt. And I want to stop on those two words, critical edition, because they sound like a formality, and they are nothing of the kind. Understand what she was actually handed. Not a book, not a scroll, not one object at all. What survives of a series like this is wreckage, broken clay, dozens upon dozens of fragments, some the size of your palm, and some the size of a coin, excavated across different sites in different decades by different expeditions, and then dispersed into museum collections in several countries, cased and cataloged under numbers that have nothing to do with each other. No single copy is complete. Many fragments preserve 6 lines and then stop mid-word because the corner sheared off 3,000 years ago. Several fragments are duplicates of the same passage in different scribal hands, with different spellings and different mistakes. The work is this. You read every fragment in the original wedges. You recognize that a piece in one collection and a piece in another are physically 2 halves of the same broken tablet, or 2 copies of the same passage, and you make what the field calls a join. You establish, from the overlaps, what order the tablets ran in and what order the lines ran in. You reconstruct a composite text out of many partial witnesses, and you record underneath it, honestly, every place the witnesses disagree and every place you are guessing. Then you translate it. Then you explain it. Until somebody does that, a corpus is not merely hard to read, it is effectively unreadable, even to specialists, even to people who read Akkadian fluently, because the thing itself does not exist in one place in any legible form. That is why the year matters. Before the year 2000, Mesopotamian physiognomy was a rumor with footnotes, a subject people alluded to, quoted in scraps, and largely could not work on. After it, there was a text. Every serious sentence written in English about this material since then, including the sentences I am saying to you now, is standing on somebody's decade of squinting at broken clay. I am not going to let that pass as a name and a date. The same courtesy is owed to the other name. A catalog text in this tradition is exactly what it sounds like. A scribal document that lists the series in the curriculum, gives their opening words, and sometimes says Who set them in order? The catalog tradition names Esagil kin Apli as the man who took a sprawl of local and inherited material and fixed it into a standard sequence, and it names him for more than one series. That is the claim. It is a later claim, made by scribes with reasons of their own to attach a canonical text to a distinguished ancestor, and it is not corroborated by anything he wrote in his own hand that we can hold. So the phrase is credited to, not proven, not invented either. Credited to and left there. And here's the other thing I am going to say once, plainly, tonight, and then I'm going to hold myself to it for the next 3 hours. This channel says Sumerian. The title of this video says Sumerian. I use it the way almost everyone uses it, as an umbrella for the whole Mesopotamian scribal world, because that is the word people search for, and that is the word people know. But the physiognomic corpus itself, the Alam Dimu, the body reading series, the material this entire episode is built on, is Babylonian and Akkadian. It is written in Akkadian, which is a Semitic language, a cousin of Hebrew and Arabic, and it comes down to us mostly in first millennium copies from Assyrian and Babylonian libraries. It sits on top of an older Sumerian scribal tradition. It uses Sumerian lexical apparatus, Sumerian sign values, Sumerian word lists as its scaffolding, and the men who wrote it were trained in Sumerian, the way a European lawyer of a certain century was trained in Latin. So the Sumerian inheritance is real, and it is structural, but the tablets are not Sumerian, and I am not going to spend 3 hours pretending otherwise. You deserve precision more than you deserve a tidy label, and every time it matters tonight, I am going to name the language. Now, what did they actually do? Picture the room. It is not a temple in the way you are imagining a temple. It is closer to an archive or a school. There is a bench. There is a basket of prepared clay. A man sits with a lump of it worked soft in his left hand, flattened into a tablet that fits his palm, and a cut reed in his right. And he is not praying. He is filing. He has been trained since childhood in a curriculum that begins with sign lists and word lists and proceeds through law and letters and omens. And the thing that has been drilled into him above everything else is the form of a sentence. If this, then that. If the sign appears, then the outcome follows. He has used that sentence on the liver of a sacrificed sheep. He has used it on the movement of a planet. He has used it on the behavior of a fox walking into a city, on the shape of oil spreading across water, on the pattern of smoke. And now he turns it on a man standing in front of him. If the forehead is like this, then such and such. If the mark is here rather than there, then this instead of that. If it is on the right, one outcome. If it is on the left, a different outcome, and often the opposite one. That grammar is the whole invention, not the answers. The grammar. And notice what it demands of him. Once you have committed to if then, you cannot stop at the interesting cases. The list becomes an obligation. If you have written down what a mark on the right cheek means, the form of the list itself now demands that you write down what a mark on the left cheek means, and then the temple, and then the jaw, and then the neck, and then downward through the whole body, region by region, side by side. And then you must do it again for the second kind of mark, and again for the third, until the series swells to something no single person could hold in memory and could only ever be consulted. That is what these men were building. Not a book to be read, a reference to be looked up, a body turned into an index. They did this everywhere, and that is the part people miss. The Mesopotamian scholarly project was the systematic conversion of the entire visible world into consultable text. The sky, the organs of animals, the behavior of rivers, the malformations of newborns, the sounds a man makes, the dreams he has. The body was simply one more surface that had not yet been indexed, and so they indexed it. The Alamdimu is what happens when a civilization with an absolute genius for lists finally turns that genius on the person standing in the doorway. Now let me give you the mainstream reading of all this at its full strength, because it is strong, and because I think it is right about nearly everything. This is divination. Full stop. It is not proto-science. It is not lost biology. It is not a research program that got interrupted. The intellectual framework underneath it is that the gods write. The gods inscribe their intentions into the material world in a script, and that script shows up in the liver, in the stars, in the birth of a deformed animal, and in the surface of a human being. The diviner is not discovering a natural regularity. He is reading a message that has been deliberately left for him by a divine author. That is a theological claim, not an empirical one, and the practitioners would not have recognized the distinction you and I are drawing right now. And you have to understand what kind of document an omen series is, because we do not really have a modern equivalent, and people reach for the wrong analogy every time. An omen series is a scholarly genre. It has conventions, an expected shape, a house style, a fixed order of body regions or celestial phenomena, or animal organs, and a place in a teaching curriculum. It is not a notebook. It is not a log. There is an enormous difference, and the difference is the whole argument between a compendium and an observational record. An observational record is something a person keeps while watching. This happened on this day, and then that followed. A compendium is a finished, ordered, transmitted body of learning that a student copies to become learned. The Mesopotamians did produce genuine observational records. The astronomical diaries are exactly that, night after night of watch sky written down as it happened. And the omen series do not look like those. They look like what they are, which is curriculum. And curriculum moves by copying. That is the transmission mechanism. A young scribe copies the series because copying the series is how you become a member of the class of men who can be trusted with the king's business. The prestige of the text is the reason it survives, and the prestige is attached to its antiquity and its completeness and its association with famous editors, not to whether any line in it was ever checked. Nobody in that room was under any obligation to test an entry. Testing was not the activity. Faithful transmission was the activity. A corrupted line was a scandal. A false line was not even a category. Once you see that clearly, a great deal of the mystique falls off this material, and it should, and the mainstream is entirely right to insist on it. So let me now do something that most channels in this corner of the internet will never do, which is put the strongest objection to my own video into my own mouth. A working Assyriologist watching this would not quarrel with my facts. She would quarrel with the frame. She would say that comparing an omen compendium to a modern medical finding is a category error at the root, because the two documents are not attempting the same act and never were. She would say that when a corpus exhaustively enumerates every position, every side, and every count, then some entry in it will inevitably align with something later measured, and that this alignment is guaranteed by the size and symmetry of the corpus rather than earned by anybody's insight. That if you write down every possible sentence, one of them will be true, and that this tells you nothing about the writer. She would say that lifting entries out of a religious genre and grading them against modern epistemology is precisely the maneuver that has funded a century of nonsense about the ancient world, and that the honest one-line description of the Alamdimu is a document in the history of religion, not a document in the history of observation. That objection is not weak. It is the strongest thing anybody says about what I am doing tonight, and I want it sitting in your head for the next 3 hours, uncomfortable, unresolved, doing its job. I think she is right about every clause except the very last one, and I will spend the rest of this video trying to earn that one exception. Second, and this is Assyriology speaking clearly, the list itself is the technology. The exhaustiveness that impresses us is not evidence of observation. It is evidence of a scribal generative logic. If you record one case, the symmetry of the form produces its opposite, and the opposite of the opposite, and the intermediate cases, whether or not any scribe ever saw such a man. Large stretches of these series are almost certainly filled out by the grammar rather than by the eye, so when I tell you later that they were exhaustive, do not hear me saying they were empirical. Exhaustive and empirical are two completely different things, and the mainstream is right to keep hammering that nail. And third, the ugly part, which I am not going to walk around. Physiognomy has a history after Babylon, and that history is genuinely poisonous. In its later European forms, in the 18th and 19th centuries, and into the 20th, the claim that character is legible on the face and the skull became one of the most effective engines of racism that has ever been built. It gave a scientific costume to the ranking of human beings. It measured skulls and produced conclusions that its measurers had decided in advance. It fed criminology. It fed colonial administration. It fed eugenics, and it ended in places that killed people on an industrial scale. When a modern scientist says the word physiognomy with disgust, that disgust is earned, and it is not squeamishness, and anyone who waves it away is either ignorant or is selling something. I want that stated at full volume in the first item of this list, rather than buried in a footnote in the 11th. So the specifics were divination. The tradition it fathered was a catastrophe, and the discipline was buried, correctly, as pseudoscience. And then it came back. In 2018, in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Mikhail Kosinski and Yilun Wang published a study in which deep neural networks were trained on facial photographs and used to classify sexual orientation. The networks were given images from a public dating source, and the headline result was reported on a paired task, given one photograph of a gay man and one of a straight man. Pick which is which, where the model was right roughly 8 times in 10 for men and roughly 7 times in 10 for women, against human judges who performed considerably worse. Let me put some scale and some shape on that, because a citation with no texture in it is just a noise a narrator makes. The image set was large. Tens of thousands of facial photographs, drawn from thousands of individual people, each one publicly posted by the person themselves and labeled by the preference that person had stated on the site. The task was not the task you are probably imagining. The machine was not looking at a crowd and picking people out. It was handed exactly 2 photographs at a time, told that one belonged to each category, and asked which was which, a forced choice between 2, where a coin lands right 5 times in 10. Human beings were given the identical pairs, and human beings were barely better than the coin, right around 6 times in 10 when judging men, and close to a coin flip when judging women. That gap between the human and the machine is the actual result. It is not that the machine was good. It is that the machine was finding something in a photograph that a person looking at the same photograph could not consciously see. In 2021, in Scientific Reports, Kosinski published a second study in which facial images were used to predict political orientation, broadly liberal against conservative, across more than one country and more than one kind of image source, including standardized photographs, at rates around 7 in 10, where pure chance is 5 in 10. And that phrase, standardized photographs, is doing quiet work, so I will make it loud. One of the obvious ways to kill a result like this is to say the machine is reading the setting. The clothes, the backdrop, the filter, the choice of pose. So part of that second study used images taken under controlled conditions. Neutral expression, plain background, no jewelry, no glasses. The sort of photograph a laboratory takes, rather than the sort a person posts. The effect dropped. but it did not vanish. Make of that what you will. I am telling you, because it is the detail that a dishonest version of this video would leave out in one direction, and an equally dishonest version would leave out in the other. Now, I am going to be extremely careful here, because this is exactly the place where a channel like this one usually starts lying to you. Above chance is not the same as accurate. A model that is right 7 times out of 10 is wrong 3 times out of 10. And if you pointed that model at an individual human being and made a decision about their life, you would be destroying roughly a third of the lives you touched. These are aggregate statistical effects across large populations, and an aggregate effect that is real can still be useless and dangerous at the level of one person. That distinction is the single most important sentence in this item. And the confounds are serious, and they are not resolved. A photograph is not a face. It is a face plus grooming, plus facial hair, plus glasses, plus cosmetics, plus camera angle, plus lighting, plus the expression a person chose, plus the self-presentation of someone who is deliberately advertising themselves on a dating profile, plus whatever systematic differences exist between the pools the images were drawn from. Any one of those could carry a signal that has nothing at all to do with the underlying bone and tissue. Some of the researchers who criticized this work argued precisely that the networks were reading styling and pose, not physiology. That criticism has real force, and I am not going to pretend it was answered to everyone's satisfaction, because it was not. And there is one more confound that gets less attention than it deserves, and it is about the labels rather than the pictures. The ground truth in that first study was not measured by anybody. It was what each person had typed about themselves on a dating platform in order to be shown to the people they wanted to be shown to. So the categories being predicted were self-declared on a specific website by a specific slice of humanity. One country, one platform, one narrow band of ages, and overwhelmingly one ethnic group. A model trained inside a box that narrow has learned the box as much as it has learned the face. And nobody should pretend a finding from that pool travels cleanly to the whole species. And I want to say the next part out loud, rather than let it sit quietly under the narration. This modern work is itself ethically contested, seriously contested. Many researchers argued at the time, and argue now, that these studies should never have been published at all. That the harm of demonstrating a working method for classifying people by orientation in a world containing states that imprison and execute people for that orientation vastly exceeds any scientific value. That is not a fringe position. It came from within the field. And the authors themselves framed the work substantially as a warning, as a demonstration that the capability exists, and that privacy assumptions about the human face are already obsolete, rather than as a tool anyone should build on. So understand exactly what I am doing here. I am not endorsing these studies. I am not telling you they are correct. I am pointing at a fact about the shape of history, and the fact is this: the discipline that Babylonian scribes invented, that the modern world examined and condemned and buried as pseudoscience for the best of reasons, has come back inside my lifetime. Funded, peer-reviewed, published in mainstream journals, argued about at conferences, and running on human faces right now, tonight, at a scale the Alamdimu scribes could not have imagined. And here is the turn, and it is not the turn you are expecting. Physiognomy did not come back because it was right. Almost every specific claim it ever made was wrong, and the tradition it produced was monstrous. It came back because of its premise. The premise was that a face is data, that a human surface is a structured, machine-readable record rather than a blank wall, And that premise, stripped of every particular conclusion the ancients drew from it, and every particular conclusion the Victorians drew from it, turned out to be operationally useful to a computer. The readings failed. The frame held. That is going to be the pattern of everything you hear tonight. And I want you to catch it here, at the start, so you recognize it when it comes around again. So do this. Think about the last time your face was measured. Your phone unlocking when you looked at it. The gate at the airport that compared your face to the chip in your passport. The photo application that quietly gathered every picture of you across 15 years and grouped them under one name without being asked. Every one of those is a system that treats your face as a document with fields in it. You have consented to being read over and over so routinely that you no longer register it as reading at all. They wrote it on the body, and the body is still carrying it. But the invention of reading a body is an abstraction, and abstractions do not keep an audience honest. So the second item is a specific mark, a small one. Almost certainly one you have on you right now, in more than one place. And the ancient scribes did something with it that I find genuinely difficult to explain away. Because of all the things they could have recorded about it, they picked the one variable that 4,000 years later would turn out to be the one that carries a real signal. Look at the inside of your left forearm. Turn it over, under decent light, and look at the pale skin from the wrist to the crook of the elbow. Do not scan it. Look at it properly, the way you would look at a page. There will be marks, small brown ones, flat or slightly raised. Possibly a reddish one, a tiny dot the color of a pinprick of wine. Somebody wrote those down. Not yours, obviously. But those marks, in that place, on that surface, cataloged in the same careful if-then grammar, the same scribal tradition used for the liver of a sheep and the position of Jupiter. Inside the Alum Dimu, there is a sub-series devoted to the marks on the skin, and it is called the Shuma Liptu, which is said Shuma Liptu. Shuma is simply the Akkadian word for if. It opens almost every omen sentence in the language, and once you know it, you start seeing it everywhere in this material, because these texts are quite literally called by their first words. And the marks themselves are named with two Akkadian words you should hear at least once tonight. The first is Umsatu, said Sa-tu, which is generally rendered as a mole or a wart, a raised or pigmented mark on the skin. The second is Pindu, said Pindu, generally a reddish mark, a red spot or blotch. Two categories of mark, one dark, one red. Now here's the part that matters, and I want to slow all the way down for it, because this is the load-bearing fact of this item. What the system cared about was where the mark was and how many there were. Location and count. Region by region down the body, and right against left as separate cases with separate meanings. That is the architecture. And the counting is not incidental to it. It is structural. The tradition does not merely note that a man has an umsatu. It works through positions and it works through numbers. And it reads an outcome off the combination of the position and the number. Sit in that room again with me. A man has come in. The scribe does not begin with the interesting mark, because the form does not permit him to begin with the interesting mark. He begins at the top and he works down, the way a surveyor works a field. Head, forehead, temple. And the right temple and the left temple are not the same entry and never will be. Cheek, jaw, neck, shoulder, chest, the flank, the arm, the hand, downward. And at each region he asks the same two questions in the same order. Is there a mark? How many? And he presses the answer into wet clay with a cut reed in exactly the same sentence shape. If such and such is present, then such and such follows. that his teacher used on a sheep's liver and his colleague across the room is using on last night's sky. He is not curing anybody. Let me be blunt about that, because I will not have you leaving here confused about it. He is not doing medicine. There is medicine in the Mesopotamian record, real medicine, therapies and drugs, and diagnostic texts, and this is a different genre with different aims. He is producing a forecast. He is trying to establish what is coming for this man. Whether he will be wealthy, whether he will be favored, whether he will die badly, whether he is safe to enter into an arrangement with. The marks are not symptoms. They are signatures, and he counts them. So now, the mainstream at full strength, and this time I am going to concede everything, because the concession is total. The readings themselves are worthless. Not partially worthless, worthless. There is no relationship whatever between a mark on the left flank and a man's fortune, and there is no relationship between a mark on the right flank and the opposite fortune, and no amount of ancient prestige changes that. There were no statistics. There were no controls. There was no follow-up, no cohort, no comparison group, nobody checking 20 years later whether the man with the mark on his shoulder had in fact become rich. The mechanism that generates a document like this in the absence of statistics is well understood, and it is the same mechanism that generates every catalog of coincidence in human history. A striking case is remembered. The confirming instance is written down. The 1,000 disconfirming instances are never recorded because nobody thought them worth recording. And the scribal symmetry I described earlier fills in the enormous gaps with cases nobody ever saw. That is not a knowledge system. That is an archive of coincidence, generated as much by grammar as by observation. Every word of that is correct, and I am not going to argue with a single line of it. And I want to take that generative logic apart properly, slowly, because it is the single best argument against everything I'm about to tell you, and it deserves better than one sentence. Watch how an entry breeds. A scribe writes, "If there is a mark on the right cheek, then such and such follows." He has now created 3 obligations he did not have a moment ago. The form demands the mirror, so he must write the left cheek. And by the internal convention of the genre, the left will usually take the opposite outcome. Not because anybody observed an opposite outcome, but because right and left are opposed in the grammar. The form demands the neighboring regions, so cheek pulls in temple, and jaw, and ear. And the form demands the other quantities, so 1 mark pulls in 2 marks, and 2 pulls in many. Multiply that out. Take the number of body regions, times 2 for the sides, times the number of mark types, times the count bands, and you are looking at a document that expands like a multiplication table. Nobody had to see any of it. The document is generating itself out of its own symmetry, which means the very thing that feels like evidence is not evidence. When you meet a list this exhaustive, your instinct is to think, they must have looked at thousands of people to fill this in. That instinct is backwards. Exhaustiveness is what a grammar produces. Observation produces gaps, irregular, lumpy, incomplete records with far more entries in the places people happened to look, and nothing at all in the places they did not. A perfectly filled grid is the fingerprint of a rule, not of a pair of eyes. So when I point at something in this corpus and call it striking, I'm obliged to ask first whether the striking thing was simply manufactured by the form, and to say so if it was. Hold me to that. It is the correct test. And now, the measurement. In 2005, in the European Journal of Cancer, Sarah Gandini and colleagues published a meta-analysis, a study that pools the results of many separate studies, on the risk factors for melanoma, the dangerous form of skin cancer. And the finding that came out of that pooling has held up and become one of the sturdiest facts in the field. The strongest single risk factor identified was not sunburn history. It was not skin type on its own. It was the total number of moles on the body. Total nevus count, to use the term, nevus simply being the clinical word for a mole. And it is worth understanding what a meta-analysis actually does, because it is not simply a longer paper. Individual studies are small and noisy, and each one is trapped inside its own population, its own country, its own decade, its own way of defining what counts as a mole. Any single one of them can be wrong by accident. What a meta-analysis does is go out and find every study that asks the question in dozens of separate published investigations, apply rules for which ones are methodologically sound enough to include, and then combine their results into one pooled estimate weighted by how much evidence each one actually contributes. The point of pooling is that the accidents of any one study tend to cancel, while a real effect present in all of them adds up and becomes visible with a precision that no single study could reach. It is the closest thing medicine has to standing back far enough to see the whole shape of a question at once. That is the kind of instrument this finding came out of, which is why it has survived 20 years of people looking at it again. The size of it is worth stating carefully. Comparing people at the top of the range, somewhere above 100 moles, against people at the bottom with fewer than about 15, the pooled risk of melanoma came out close to 7 times higher, and it rises gradually across the range rather than jumping at a threshold. More marks, more risk in a steady ascending line. Now let me explain what that actually means, because it is very easy to hear it wrongly and frighten yourself for no reason. It is not that a mole becomes the cancer. That is the intuitive picture, and it is mostly wrong. The great majority of melanomas do not arise out of an existing mole at all. What the mole count is doing is acting as a marker, a visible, countable readout of something underneath that you cannot see. A person who produces a great many moles is a person whose pigment cells are, constitutionally, more inclined to proliferate. That inclination is written into their genetics and their early life sun exposure, and the moles are simply the part of it that shows on the outside. So the count is not the disease, and it is not the cause of the disease. It is the visible register of an underlying tendency, and it happens to be a better register than almost anything else a person can observe about themselves without a laboratory. And notice the other half of that sentence. 7 times higher sounds enormous, and it is a real multiplication, but it is a multiplication of a baseline that is small to begin with for most people. A number that many times a small number is still, for the overwhelming majority of individuals who hear it tonight, a small number. It sorts a population into bands. It does not issue anybody a verdict. Say the calm version of that out loud with me, because I do not want anyone spiraling tonight. Most moles are nothing. The overwhelming majority of the marks on your skin will do absolutely nothing to you across your entire life. A high count does not mean you are ill, and it does not mean you will become ill. It means you sit in a group with somewhat elevated risk, which is a statement about a group and not a prophecy about you. I am not a doctor, and this is not medical advice. The sane, boring, real-world action is the one every dermatologist gives. A mark that changes in size, in shape, in color, in border, one that bleeds or will not heal, gets looked at by an actual physician. Changing is the word that matters, not present. Changing. And here is the turn, and this is the sharp one, so stay with me. Think about everything the Babylonian system could have chosen to record about a mole. It could have built itself on color, and color would have been the obvious choice. Dark against light, the red mark against the brown one. It could have built itself on texture, whether it was smooth or rough under the finger. It could have built itself on whether it itched, whether it hurt, whether it wept, whether it had hair growing from it. Any of those would have been natural, and any of those would have been dead ends. They built it on position and count. And count is exactly the variable that turned out to carry the real signal. Not next year. Not in some vague adjacent sense. 4,000 years later, in a pooled analysis of the medical literature, the number of marks on a human body turned out to be the single, strongest observable predictor of that person's risk from a specific cancer. Stronger than the things everybody would have guessed. Of every question you could ask about a mole, how many is the one that pays? They counted moles and read fate. We count moles and read risk. The reading is different. The reading they produced was rubbish, and the reading we produce is measured. But the instrument is identical. A pair of eyes, going over a body region by region, adding up marks. And I want to flag exactly what I am claiming, because this is where a channel like this one would normally overreach. I am not saying they knew about melanoma. They did not. I am not saying the Shuma Liptu contains hidden medicine. It does not. I am saying something narrower, and, I think, stranger. That the variable they selected out of all available variables is the variable that carries information, and that this is a coincidence of a very specific and uncomfortable shape. That is my inference. Their text does not say it. So do the thing now. Actually do it, I will wait. Start with the forearms, both of them, inside and out, wrist to elbow, and count every distinct brown mark. The inner forearm is the pale side, the side that has been shaded most of your life, and it is where the marks tend to be smallest and flattest and easiest to skim past. So go slowly there. Then turn the arm over and do the outer side, which has taken far more sun and usually carries more than you expect. Then the backs of both hands. People always forget the hands, and the reason is simple. You look at your hands constantly, which means you have stopped seeing them. Count them anyway. Then the shoulders, and then, if there is a mirror behind you or somebody in the house who will look for you, the upper back, which is the site people undercount worst of all, for the obvious reason that they have never once seen it properly, and which on a great many people carries the highest concentration on the entire body. Then the chest, and along the ribs under the arm, where marks hide in the fold. Then run your fingertips along the hairline at the back of the neck and up into the scalp, which almost nobody counts and which is not empty. Here's what the ancient system would have made of that survey, and I want you to feel the double exposure of it. The scribe would have gone down that identical route, top of the head, forehead, temple, cheek, neck, shoulder, chest, flank, arm, hand, in that order, asking your two questions. Is there a mark, and how many? And treating your right side and your left side as two entirely separate cases, with two entirely separate futures. You have just performed his procedure. The root is his root. The two questions are his two questions. Only the last step differs. He turned the total into a fortune, and you are going to turn it into nothing at all, because a number is not a diagnosis, and I am not handing you one. Take your time. This takes a minute, and it is worth the minute. Most adults land somewhere between 10 and 40. Some people have 3. Some people have well over 100 and have never once counted them and are about to be surprised by their own skin. And if your number came in high, hear the calm sentence again rather than the frightening one. High is a band, not a sentence. It changes nothing about today. It changes one small habit, which is that you look occasionally and you notice change. Note your number. Hold on to it. Say it out loud if you are alone, because I want it in your head and not in a mental fog. And because the third item on this list is going to say something about that number that you are not expecting. They wrote it on the body, and the body is still carrying it. Now, open your hands, both of them, palms up, and hold them there. Because the next item is about the part of yourself you have looked at more than any other part and never actually examined. It is the one place a Babylonian scholar and a modern clinician would both stop and stare. And it is also the place where the fraud lives, where somebody is going to try to take everything I just told you and sell it back to you as a service. So I'm going to do something in the next item that I have not done yet. I am going to knock a thing down myself, on purpose, before anybody can use tonight's episode to charge you for it. Look at your palms. Really look. There are lines running across them, and you have seen them every day of your life, and you have almost certainly never counted them. There are, in most people, two major creases running across the palm. Not the vertical ones, not the small chaotic web of fine lines that thickens as you age. The two big transverse ones, the deep ones, the ones that fold when you close your fist. In a small percentage of people, there is one, a single crease, running all the way across, from one edge of the palm to the other. We will come to what that means, and we will come to it very carefully, because I am going to tell you plainly, before I even start, that nobody watching this should be frightened by their own hand. But first I want to tell you what the Mesopotamian scribes did with the hand, and it is not what you expect, and it is stranger and more impressive than divination. The series is the Nabnitu, which is said Nabni-tu, and which appears in the sources under its Sumerian designation, written Sig 7 Aelin. And the Nabnitu is not a book of omens. That is the point I want you to hold on to. The Nabnitu is a lexical series. So let me explain what a lexical series actually is, because this is one of the genuinely great intellectual artifacts of the ancient world, and almost nobody outside the field has heard of the category. A lexical series is a list. That sounds like nothing. It is not nothing. Mesopotamian scholarship was built on lists, vast, systematic, standardized lists of words, organized by subject, copied and recopied across centuries in scribal schools from Nippur to Nineveh. Lists of trees, lists of stones, lists of professions, of vessels, of animals, of legal terms, of gods. And these lists were typically bilingual, a Sumerian term in one column and its Akkadian equivalent in the other, which makes them, among other things, the oldest systematic dictionaries on the planet. They were pedagogy. A young scribe learned by copying them out, over and over, until the sequence lived in his hand. But they were more than pedagogy, and this is where they get interesting, because to build a list, you must first decide what belongs on it, and in what order. A list is a claim about the structure of the world. It says, these things are members of one class. It says, this one comes before that one. It says, this whole and these parts. And the Nabnitu takes the human body and does exactly that to it. It organizes the body into named, listed, indexable components. It moves through the parts. It supplies the vocabulary, the Sumerian and the Akkadian, for the exterior and for the members and for the features. It is a systematic terminology for a human being, assembled by scholars who had decided that the body was a domain that could be enumerated the way you enumerate trees or stones or vessels. Understand what has to happen in a culture before that document can exist. Somebody has to look at a person and see, not a person, but a structured object with parts that stand in fixed relations and deserve stable names. That is the precondition for anatomy. It is not anatomy. It is the filing system that anatomy will later need. Before you can say anything true about the hand, you need a word for the hand that means the same thing to you and to the man reading your tablet in another city 40 years from now. The lexical series is the machine that produces that agreement. And then, separately, in the divinatory corpus, in the physiognomic material itself, the hand and the fingers get their own sustained attention. Marks on the hand, the shape of the fingers, the features of the palm. The scribes went over the hand in detail and gave it more room than its share of the body's surface area would suggest. I have an inference about why, and I will flag it as mine rather than theirs. Here I am, reaching past what the text says. The hand got special attention because the hand is the part of yourself that you can see without a mirror. Think about that for a second in a world with no mirrors worth the name. Polished bronze, at best, expensive, distorting, rare. You cannot examine your own face. You cannot see your own back or your own shoulders. If a mark appears there, you learn about it because somebody tells you. But the hand is always available. You can hold it up in daylight, turn it, trace it, compare left against right, and you can do it 100 times a day without asking anyone's permission. For a tradition built on reading the visible surface of a person, the palm is the single richest and most accessible page in the entire book. Of course, it got worked over. Now, the mainstream explanation, and it is unusually clean here, and I think it is basically correct. The lexical lists are vocabulary and pedagogy. That is what they are for. They are training documents for scribes and reference tools for a literate profession, and reading them as proto-anatomy is a modern imposition. They are not describing how the body works. They are not investigating anything. They are not the product of dissection or observation of function. They are a curriculum. The organization reflects linguistic and scholastic convention, not biological insight. And the hand omens are divination. They are exactly what they appear to be. A system of signs read for prognostic content by a scholarly class, generated by the same conventions of side and position and orientation that generate the rest of the corpus. There is nothing in the record that resembles a modern diagnostic claim. Nobody in Babylon connected a crease to a chromosome, because nobody in Babylon had a chromosome to connect it to. When I put ancient handreading and modern handreading in the same paragraph, I am putting two unrelated activities side by side, and the only thing they share is the object they are staring at. Full strength, probably right about all the specifics. Now the modern finding, and this one is real, published, uncontroversial in its existence, and very easy to misuse. Which is why I'm going to hedge it before I state it, and again after. The single transverse palmar crease. Most people, as I said, have two major creases running horizontally across the palm. A small proportion of people have one, a single deep crease running the full width of the hand. The feature is common enough that you may well be looking at it right now on one of your own hands, and it has a genuine, published association with chromosomal anomaly, most familiarly with trisomy 21, and with certain developmental syndromes. That association is real. It is in the clinical literature. It is taught. And now, immediately, the careful part, and I want you to hear this before you have finished looking at your own palm. It also occurs in perfectly typical people, at a low but real rate. It occurs more often on one hand than on both. It occurs more often in men. It runs in some families as an ordinary inherited variation with no implication whatsoever. And in clinical practice, it is what is called a soft sign, a flag, not a diagnosis. It is one small piece of information that might, in combination with a great many other pieces of information, prompt someone to look further. On its own, in isolation, in an adult who is sitting there watching a documentary, it means nothing about you. Let me say that as plainly as I can. If you are looking at a single crease across one of your palms right now, you have learned nothing about yourself that should worry you. Nothing. That is not what this feature does in an adult. Do not go and look up anything. Do not carry this into tonight. Because the reason I am telling you about it is not the diagnosis. It is the mechanism. And the mechanism is beautiful. Palm creases are not wear marks. They are not worn into your hand by use, the way a path is worn across a lawn. They are formed before you are born. They develop in the womb, in a specific window, around the same period as the hand's early flexion, as the fetal hand first begins to curl and move and fold against itself. The creases are laid down where that folding happens, and once laid down, they are permanent. Your palm creases at 70 are the palm creases you had at birth, which means the pattern on your palm is a record of an event you cannot remember and nobody photographed. It is a physical trace of how your hand developed in a window of a few weeks before you had a face anyone would recognize. And that is exactly why it correlates with developmental conditions. Not because the crease causes anything or reveals a fate, but because a condition that alters early development can alter the movement and folding of the fetal hand during that window, and the crease pattern preserves the difference. The hand is a document of embryology. You are carrying, on the front of your hand, in plain sight, a legible record of your own formation. That is true. That is not mysticism. That is developmental biology, and it is on both of your hands, and you can see it from where you are sitting. And that is precisely why I now have to do something unpleasant. Because I know exactly what happens to material like this. Somebody is going to take that last paragraph. The hand is a document of embryology. The palm is legible. The ancients studied the hand, and they are going to build a business out of it. They are going to sell you a palm reading. They are going to sell you an iris reading. They are going to sell you a course, a certification, a personalized report, a consultation at a price. And they are going to cite people like me while they do it. Because a documentary voice saying the hand carries real information is the most useful thing a fraudulent practitioner can put in front of a nervous customer. So I am going to knock those down myself, right now, on purpose. In the middle of my own episode, at the exact moment when the material is at its most sellable. Start with iris diagnosis, because the test case there is unusually clean, and I want you to see what an honest test of a claim like this looks like. Iris diagnosis, iridology, holds that the iris of the eye is a map of the body's organs, and that a trained practitioner, examining the markings and coloration of the iris, can identify disease elsewhere in the body. It is a direct structural cousin of what we have been discussing all night. A visible surface read as a chart of the interior. If any modern practice ought to be vindicated by everything I have been telling you, it is this one. In 1988, in the British Medical Journal, Nipschild published a controlled trial of it. And I want to walk you through the design, because the design is the whole lesson. You take two groups of people. One group has a specific, confirmed, objectively verifiable condition, in this case, gallbladder disease, confirmed by proper investigation, not by anybody's opinion. The other group does not have it. Then, you photograph the irises of everybody in both groups. Then, you take practicing iridologists, not skeptics playing at it, actual practitioners who believe in the method and use it professionally, and you show them the photographs, and you ask them to say who is which. That is it. That is the whole test. And notice what it does. It removes every channel of information except the one being claimed. The practitioner cannot see the patient walk in, cannot see their age, their color, their weight, their posture, how they hold themselves, whether they wince, cannot hear them speak, cannot ask a leading question, cannot read a face for a flinch when a guess lands near the mark. All the ordinary human cues that let a confident person appear to know things about a stranger are stripped out, and what is left is exactly what the claim says is sufficient: the iris. The iridologists could not distinguish the patients with gallbladder disease from those without. That is the right kind of test. And I want to say why in one more sentence, because this matters beyond iridology. It is the right kind of test because it isolates the claimed mechanism and gives it a fair chance to work alone. If the iris carried the information, the photographs would carry it, and trained readers would score above chance. They did not. The method was given precisely the conditions it says it needs, and it failed. Now, modern palmistry is not this material. Iris diagnosis is not this material. Let me be as direct as I know how to be. Neither is supported, not by the evidence, not by any mechanism anyone has been able to describe, and not by anything I have said tonight. The fact that a palm crease forms in the womb and correlates weakly with developmental conditions does not license anybody to tell you about your marriage, your career, your character, or the year you will die. Those are different claims by an enormous margin, and there is no bridge between them. A crease that records fetal flexion is not a lifeline. Nobody has ever demonstrated a lifeline. And I want to draw the distinction that I think is the real moral center of this whole episode. The Babylonian scribes were doing something intellectually serious and wrong. Serious, systematic, cumulative, standardized, transmitted across centuries, self-consistent, built by people trying as hard as they could with the instruments they had, working in a world where there was no way to know they were wrong. Wrong. Almost every specific reading they produced was false, generated by convention rather than by observation. Serious and wrong. That combination deserves respect, and it is why I have spent this long with them. The modern practitioner charging you money for a palm reading is doing something neither serious nor honest. Not serious, because the method has been tested, and there is nothing there, and the information is freely available to anyone who wants it. And not honest, because they have access to that information and take your money anyway. The scribe could not have known. The practitioner in the year 2026 can know, and has decided not to. So let me be explicit about what I am doing here. I am inoculating you on purpose. Deliberately in the middle of my own video, at cost to my own material. If somebody quotes this episode at you, if somebody sends you a clip of me saying the hand is a document of embryology, or the body's surface is a legible record, and uses it to sell you a reading, a chart, a consultation, an iris photograph, a personalized report, I want you to remember this passage. I want you to remember that the man in the video knocked it down himself, at length, before anyone got the chance. Nothing in this episode supports paying anybody to read your hand. Nothing in this episode ever will. Here's what is actually true, and it is enough. The hand really is legible. It carries a genuine record of your development, of a few weeks in the womb, of the way a set of tissues folded before you existed as a person anyone had met. That record is real, and it is readable, and modern medicine reads it cautiously as one soft signal among many. It is simply not legible in the way anyone selling you a reading claims. The information is real. The fortune is not. So do this now, while it is in front of you. Open both palms, right and left, and hold them under whatever light you have. Take the thumb of one hand and trace the creases of the other. Press into them. Follow them from edge to edge. Feel where they run and where they stop. Count the major ones. Not the fine web, not the vertical lines. The deep transverse folds, the ones that close when you make a fist. Count them on the right. Then count them on the left. Now compare the two hands. They will not match. They almost never do exactly, and that asymmetry is itself a record. Two hands, same body, same womb, developing in slightly different conditions in the same few weeks, and preserving the difference for the rest of your life. You are holding two documents, written before you were born, in a language you were never taught, by a process you had no say in, and you have been carrying them in front of your face every day since. They wrote it on the body, and it is still written there. And now I want to change the question entirely, because everything so far has been prediction. The mark as a sign of what is coming, the surface red for a future. The next item is not about the future at all. It is about the moment somebody in Mesopotamia looked at a body mark and used it not to predict a fate, but to prove an identity, to establish, in a court, on a contract, in a way that could be enforced, that a specific human being and no other had stood in that room and agreed to that thing. They found something on the body that could not be forged, and they pressed it into wet clay, and we did not work out why it could not be forged until 3 years ago. Everything I have just knocked down had one thing in common. Every one of those systems was asking a body about the future. The iris, the palm, the promise that a line in your hand knows the year you will die. I took those apart on purpose, and I will keep taking them apart whenever they surface in this material, because a man who will not say the word wrong out loud is not worth listening to when he says the word right. So put the future away now. Set it down. For the next stretch of this, we are not talking about prophecy at all, and the thing I am about to describe is not divination. And I want that clear before the first sentence of it, because it is the only entry on this list of 12 that was never magic and never claimed to be. Press your thumb into something soft, a piece of bread, the skin of an orange, the pad of your other hand. Press hard enough to leave a dent, and then look at what you left behind. You have just performed, badly and with no witnesses, the oldest surviving act of biometric identification in the human record. Because the fifth thing they wrote about the marks on your body was not a fortune, it was a signature. Here is the setting, and I want to build it slowly, because the scene is the argument. Move forward in time now, past the Great Compendia, into the Neo-Babylonian period, into the long centuries when Babylon was a working commercial city and not a legend. A city of temples with enormous estates, of grain measured out and lent, of houses sold, of slaves bought, of dowries negotiated, of debts that came due in the month after the harvest. A city that ran as every city has ever run on the problem of holding people to what they said. And in that city, contracts were written on clay, not on paper, not on skin, not on wood, on a lump of river clay, worked in the hand until it was smooth and damp and would take an impression, then shaped into a tablet that sat in the palm like a thick biscuit. The scribe cut the wedges into the wet surface with a reed stylus while the parties stood there. He wrote the terms. He wrote the amount of silver, the quantity of barley, the name of the field, and its neighbors on all four sides. He wrote the month, the day, the year of the king, and then, at the end, he wrote the names of the witnesses, one after another. Men who had stood in the room and seen it happen, because a document with no witnesses was not a document. But a name written by a scribe proves nothing about the man it names. The scribe wrote all of the names. He wrote them in the same hand, with the same stylus, in the same half hour. So how does the tablet carry any trace of the specific human beings who agreed to the thing? The ordinary answer, the answer of the wealthy and the official and the institutional, was the cylinder seal, a small barrel of hard stone, sometimes no longer than your thumb joint, carved in reverse around its outside with a scene, a figure before a god, an animal, a symbol, sometimes a line of writing. You rolled it across the damp clay, and it left a continuous band of image, and that image belonged to you, or to your office, or to your family. It was a beautiful technology, and it worked for about 3,000 years. But not everyone owned a cylinder seal. That is the whole point of what comes next. A seal was cut stone, it was commissioned, it cost money, and enormous numbers of the people who appear in these documents as debtors, as sellers, as witnesses, as parties of every kind, simply did not have one. And yet, they still had to be bound to the tablet. The transaction still had to be closed. The clay was drying while they stood there. So the Neo-Babylonian documentary record shows us what they did instead. And it is one of those small facts that reorganizes everything around it once you have understood it. A man without a seal validated the tablet with his own body. He pressed his fingernail into the clay. The Akkadian word for that nail is supru, or he took the hem of his garment, the woven edge of the cloth he was actually wearing at that moment, and he pressed that into the surface instead. And the word for that hem is sisiktu, and the weave of it went into the clay and stayed. Sit with the picture. The room is small. The light is bad. The scribe has finished writing, and he turns the tablet round on the table, so the last clear patch of surface faces the man. Somebody says his name aloud. The witnesses are standing close, because they have to be able to say later that they saw it. And this man, who cannot write, who owns no carved stone, who has nothing in the world that stands for him in an archive, leans over a piece of wet river mud and presses the edge of his own thumb into it. A little ridge of clay pushes up around the dent. He straightens up. It is done. He is now legally inside that document. And then the tablet dried. Sometimes it was fired, deliberately, in a kiln, which turns clay into something close to stone and close to immortal. It went into a jar, or onto a shelf in a room in a house, or a temple archive. The house eventually burned, or fell, or was abandoned, and the mound closed over it, and the centuries went past in the dark. The Persians came, and the Greeks, and the Parthians. And Babylon stopped being a city, and became a rumor and then a hill, and the dent stayed. That is the part I cannot get past. 25 centuries later, a man with a trowel took that tablet out of the ground, and it went into a crate, and it went onto a ship, and it went into a museum drawer with a number on it, and it is sitting in that drawer right now, tonight, while you are listening to this. And the mark of one particular human thumb, belonging to one particular man, whose name is written 2 lines above it, is still there in the fired clay. Not a portrait of him, not a description, the actual physical impression of the surface of his actual body, taken from life, preserved by accident, outliving his city, his language, his gods, and his entire civilization. Now I have to give you the caveat, and I have to give it at full strength, because this is exactly the place where this kind of video usually starts lying to you. This is not a fingerprint in our sense. I want to be exact about what this does and does not show. There is no evidence that Babylonian scribes were reading the ridge pattern. None. There is no evidence that anybody compared one nail impression with another to identify a man. No evidence of a filing system organized by pattern. No evidence of a dispute ever settled by matching 2 marks. No forensic science of any kind. Nobody in that room was thinking about loops and whorls and arches. The mainstream position among Assyriologists is that the nail mark and the hem mark are tokens of presence, proof that a particular body was in the room and touched the document at the moment it was made, and not identifiers that could be checked against a person later. That position is correct, and I am not going to soften it. If someone tells you the Babylonians had fingerprint forensics, they are inventing. But hold the two halves of this in your hands at the same time, because the caveat kills the strong claim, and it does not touch the interesting one. When these people needed a thing in the world that belonged to one person and to no other, a thing that could not be lent to a friend, could not be stolen out of a box, could not be copied by a rival, could not be denied afterwards by the man himself, they did not reach for a name. A name is shared by hundreds. They did not reach for a signature, which is a habit of the hand and can be practiced by a forger. They did not reach for an oath, though they had oaths and used them constantly and swore them by terrifying gods. They reached past all of that, and they reached for the body. They took the edge of the man himself, and they put it into the permanent medium. 4,000 years before anybody invented the word biometric, the legal answer to the question, "Who are you?" was a piece of your surface, pressed into something that hardens. Now, the measurement. 2023. The journal Cell, work by Ho, Zhang, Glover, and their colleagues, which finally described the developmental machinery that produces the pattern on your fingertip. And I want to go slowly here, because this is one of those explanations that sounds like it is about a small thing and is actually about how bodies get made. The ridges on your fingers are not noise. They are not scratches. They are not a texture that happened to you. They are laid down by a patterning process, very like the one that puts stripes on some animals and spots on others. Waves of ridge formation that begin at separate places on the fingertip, spread outward across the skin, and meet each other. Where those advancing waves collide, they are forced to resolve into a shape, and the shape they resolve into is the thing that gets called a loop, or a whirl, or an arch. The work in that cell paper identified the signaling genes that drive it, and here's the detail that should stop you. They are genes from the same toolkit that builds limbs. The system that decided where your fingers would be is the system that decided how the skin on the ends of them would fold. The timing matters more than anything else in this item. This all happens in the womb, in a narrow window, roughly between the 10th and the 16th week. Before you had lungs that had ever worked. Before your mother could feel you move. And after that window closes, the pattern is finished. It is not updated. It does not develop further in childhood. It does not change at puberty. It does not drift in old age. Your fingerprints grew larger with your hands, the way a drawing on a balloon gets larger when you inflate it. And that is the only thing that ever happened to them again. Which is why identical twins do not have identical fingerprints. Think about what that means, because it is the cleanest possible demonstration. Two people with the same genome, the same parents, the same womb, the same nutrition, the same day of birth. Their prints are similar. Statistically, more similar than yours and mine. Similar enough that a careless look would confuse them. And they are not the same. They are not the same because the pattern is not a code copied out of the genes. It is the frozen output of a physical process that ran once in fluid at a particular moment with the ordinary randomness that any physical process has. The genes wrote the rules of the process. The process wrote the print. Nobody, including the genome, could have predicted the exact result in advance. And here is why the mark is durable enough to matter. The pattern is not written in the surface layer of your skin, the part that flakes off you constantly and is entirely replaced every few weeks. It is anchored in the deeper layer beneath it, and the surface is simply printed from below, over and over, for your entire life. Scrape your fingertip raw. Burn it lightly. Cut it. As long as the damage does not go deep enough to destroy that lower layer, The ridges come back exactly as they were. Not approximately. Exactly. The body has been keeping the master copy the whole time. So put those two things side by side. Of every surface on the human body, they could have chosen to press into that clay. The flat of the palm, the heel of the hand, an elbow, a knuckle, the ball of the foot, the lip, any of them. They chose the one part that was, entirely unbeknownst to them, permanent, effectively unique, and finished before birth. They picked the only surface on a person that had already stopped changing before that person had drawn a breath. They picked the one mark that would still identify a specific human being 25 centuries after his death, in a building in a country he had never heard of, in a language that did not exist yet. They were not reading the ridges. I have said that, and I will say it again, so that nobody quotes half of this. They did not know the ridges meant anything. What they knew was the shape of the question. When you need something in the world that is one person and no other, take it off the body. And when we finally built the machine to answer that question properly, 3,000 years later, the machine looked at the same square centimeter of skin they did. They wrote it on the body, and the body is still carrying it. So do this now. Before we go on, hold your thumb up under a light, a lamp, the screen you are watching this on. Tilt it slowly until the light comes across it sideways, rather than straight down, because straight down flattens it and sideways lifts it. Now you can see them. The ridges, the loop or the whorl at the center, the little bright lines and the shadows between them. Look at how fine it is. How organized, how deliberate it looks. Every one of those lines was laid down in a period of a few weeks while you were about the size of a plum. Not one of them has changed since. Your face has changed completely. Your voice has changed. Your entire personality has been replaced 2 or 3 times. That has not moved. And you used it this morning. You picked up a piece of glass and you touched it with that thumb, and it opened. Because the most advanced consumer technology on Earth has quietly settled on exactly the same solution as a barley farmer with no seal. He pressed it into clay. You press it into a sensor. It is the same gesture, performed for the same reason, using the same piece of the same animal. Now. The 6th one is the item where I am going to do the most damage to my own case, and I want you braced for it. Because it is coming. Because if the thumb is the part of the body that turned out to be exactly as unique as they hoped, the face is the part that turned out to be almost nothing like what they believed. And the Mesopotamian scholars had far more to say about faces than about thumbs. They had a whole subseries of it. It is one of the largest, most confident, most systematically organized parts of the entire corpus. And it is also, without any competition at all, the single most catastrophic idea in this material, because it did not die quietly. It came forward, it got adopted, dressed up, given instruments and journals and a scientific vocabulary, and then it was used, in living memory, to sort human beings by worth and to justify killing them. So look at your own face while I tell you this, and then keep listening. Because I am going to hand the skeptics the microphone in the middle of it, and I am not going to take it back. The sub-series is the Nigdim-Dimu, which is said Nig-Dim-Dim-Mu. It is the build and features section of the Alam-Dimu, which is said Alam-Dim-Mu, the great physiognomic compendium we opened this whole video with. And the modern critical edition of that corpus is Barbara Box, published in 2000. Where other parts of the system dealt with marks that had arrived on the body, the moles, the discolorations, the scars. The Nigdim-Dimu dealt with the body's construction, its build, its proportions, what shape it was, and the way it worked was contrast, systematically applied. This is not a poetic list of impressions. It is a grid. Take a feature, the face, the forehead, the cheeks, the jaw, the neck, the shoulders, the whole frame, and take an axis of variation and then run the axis, broad or narrow, long or short, heavy or light, thick or thin, high or low, full or hollow. For each pole of each axis, an outcome is assigned. This man will prosper. This man will not. This man is quarrelsome. This man will die before his time. This household will scatter. Do it for one feature, and you have a superstition. Do it for every feature on the body, in fixed order from the crown of the head downward, with each observation getting its own line and its own consequence, and something else has happened. You have built a system of proportion. You have decided that a human being can be described completely as a set of measurements against an implied norm, and that every deviation from that norm carries information. The Babylonian scholars did not think they were inventing a prejudice. They thought they were completing a catalog. Now, the mainstream explanation, and I am not going to soften a syllable of it, because this is the one place in this video where the responsible position is also the harsh one. This is the direct ancestor of the worst pseudoscience in modern history, not a distant relative. The same idea, wearing better clothes. In the 19th century, that premise, that the shape of a face and a skull encodes the character of the person inside it, was picked up by men with calipers and measuring tapes who believed they were doing biology. They measured foreheads and jaws and the angles of noses. They filled skulls with lead shot to compare their volume. They published tables. They built typologies of the criminal face and the degenerate face and the trustworthy face, and then those typologies were used, in the century I was almost born in, to rank whole populations of human beings against each other, to justify colonial administration, to justify sterilization, and finally to justify industrial murder. People were sorted toward death partly on the authority of the shape of their heads. That is the debt. Any modern claim that a face predicts character starts already owing it. And a claim that starts owing that debt does not get the ordinary courtesy we extend to a new finding. It has to be held to a punishing standard, and if it does not meet that standard, it has to be dropped, immediately and out loud, by the person who raised it. That person, in this video, is me. So here is the modern claim, stated fairly and at its strongest, the way its own authors stated it. 2008. Proceedings of the Royal Society B, Carre, and McCormick. The measurement is called the facial width to height ratio, usually shortened to FWHR, and you can take it yourself in about 10 seconds. Width is measured across the face at its widest point over the cheekbones. Height is measured from the brow to the upper lip. Divide the width by the height. That is the number. A wide, short face gives you a high ratio. A narrow, long face gives you a low one. Carey and McCormick reported that this ratio was associated with aggressive behavior, and I want you to understand why that was genuinely exciting rather than merely lurid, because if you do not understand why serious people found it interesting, you will not understand why it took so long to fall apart. It was exciting because there was a plausible mechanism sitting right there. Facial bone is not decoration. It grows, and it grows under hormonal instruction, and the instruction arrives at specific times, in the womb, and then again, far more visibly, at puberty. The proposal was straightforward. Hormone exposure shapes both the growth of the midface and, separately, aspects of behavior and temperament, so the face would carry a legible record of the same hormonal history that shaped the person. It was not a claim that the face causes anything. It was a claim that the face and the behavior share an upstream author. It was measurable with a photograph and a ruler. It could be tested on any population you liked, alive or dead. It fitted a wider body of work on hormones and development. It was, on paper, a beautiful hypothesis, and it did not survive. That is the part I want to spend real time on, because the way it failed is more instructive than the finding ever was. Here is what happened. The early results came from small samples. Not fraudulent, not lazy, just small. The ordinary size of a study when a field is young and nobody yet knows the effect is worth spending money on. Small samples are noisy, and noise, by definition, sometimes produces a striking pattern out of nothing at all. Then other researchers, excited by the result, went and looked in larger groups. And in the larger groups, the effect got smaller. Then people improved the controls, and it got smaller again. Then it was tested in samples of thousands rather than dozens, in different countries, in different populations, with the measurements taken by people who had no stake in the answer, and at that point it largely vanished. That includes Kosinski's 2017 work on the facial width to height ratio, which is worth naming specifically for a reason I will get to in a moment. Working with large samples, he looked for the claimed relationships between this ratio and the behavioral and personality outcomes that had been attached to it, and did not find them. Not found and dismissed. Not found. Now, the machinery. Why does an effect appear cleanly, get published in a good journal, get cited hundreds of times, get into popular science books and management seminars, and then evaporate? There are 4 reasons, and they operate together. And once you can see them, you will see them everywhere for the rest of your life. The first is sample size, which I have already described. A small study is a small telescope. It cannot distinguish a real faint signal from a smudge on the lens. And the smaller it is, the more likely it is that anything it does report is exaggerated. The second is flexibility in measurement, and this one is subtler and more corrosive. There is no single canonical way to measure this ratio. Where exactly is the widest point of the face? At the cheekbone? At the soft tissue over it? At the bone underneath? Where exactly is the top of the height measurement? The brow ridge? The upper eyelid? The hairline? Do you use a photograph or a physical measurement? Do you correct for the angle of the head? Every one of those decisions is defensible, and every one of those decisions gives a slightly different number. A researcher with a hypothesis and several defensible options is not a liar, but he is a man who will, without ever knowing he is doing it, drift toward the version of the measurement that shows the thing he expects. The third is the file drawer. Suppose 20 teams test this. 4 find something. 16 find nothing. The 4 write it up, because a finding is a paper. The 16 mostly do not, because for a long time a null result was almost unpublishable. It read as a failed experiment, rather than as information. So the literature, which is the only thing any of us can see, contains 4 positives and no negatives, and it looks like a settled fact when the underlying reality was 4 out of 20. The fourth is confounding, and here it is embarrassingly simple. That ratio is not independent of the rest of the body. Bigger heads, heavier bodies, more muscle mass, different body composition, all of these move the number. And those same things are separately associated with the behaviors in question, for reasons that have nothing whatever to do with facial architecture encoding a personality. A large, heavy man behaves differently in a confrontation than a small, light one, and other people behave differently toward him, and both of those facts will happily masquerade as a finding about the shape of his face. So let me say the honest current verdict, as plainly as I can put it, in one sentence, so that it can be quoted on its own. The facial width to height ratio does not reliably predict aggression in individuals. It does not tell you who to trust, who to hire, who to fear, or who to avoid. Whatever faint statistical residue survives in some populations is nowhere near strong enough to say anything about any actual person, and anyone still selling that measurement to you as a read on a human being is behind the literature and should be treated accordingly. And now, I am going to tell you why I put this item in the video at all, because you deserve to hear the reasoning rather than just the result. A person who only shows you the wins is selling you something. That is the whole rule. If I had wanted a clean story, I would simply have left item 6 out. It would have been effortless. You would never have known it existed. Nobody would have written in to complain about the gap, and the video would have run smoother without it. 11 findings that all point the same way. No stumble in the middle. No long passage where I stand here explaining why the exciting thing turned out to be nothing. Leaving it out is exactly, precisely, what a dishonest version of this video would do. I am showing you this one collapsing so that you can trust the other 11. That is the trade. Every minute I have just spent dismantling a result I could have used is a minute that costs me and buys you something. The knowledge that when I tell you about a real finding later in this video, I am not a man who hides the ones that failed. Check me on it. You now know what it looks like when I have nothing. So what survives? Something, but keep it small and keep it honest. What survives is not that a face predicts aggression. That is dead, and I have just helped bury it. What survives is the far quieter fact underneath it. Facial bone proportion is a real record of hormonal and developmental history. It is not arbitrary. It did not arrive at random. The architecture of your midface was built under instruction, over years, by chemistry with a schedule, and it is a genuine physical trace of the conditions under which you grew. In that narrow, unglamorous sense, the face is a document. The Babylonians were catastrophically wrong about what that document says. They thought it said prosperity, quarrelsome, ruin, an early death. It does not say any of those things, and it never did. But they were not wrong that it says something. They wrote it on the body, and the body still answers to it. Which brings us to a mark that is even further out of your sight than that one. One that is not inside you at all, that is fully visible, sitting in the open on the outside of your body in ordinary daylight, that anyone standing behind you can see in a moment, and that you almost certainly have never looked at. Reach up. Right now, with your dominant hand, reach over the top of your head and find the crown, the place at the back of the top of your skull where the hair stops lying flat and starts to turn. Run your fingertips in a small circle there until you feel it catch. That spot where the grain of the hair changes direction and spirals out from a center point. Everyone has one. Some people have two. Find yours. Now try to tell me which way it goes. You almost certainly cannot, and that is the point I am going to end this half of the video on, so hold on to the feeling. The physiognomic corpus contains omens read off hair. The way it grows, where it grows, how thick it is, and the direction and placement of the patterns it makes as it comes out of the scalp. Growth pattern as sign. And I am going to hold to the same rule I held to a moment ago. I will not hand you a specific line, because I would be inventing it. What is defensible is the category. Hair, including the way it turns, was inside the readable surface. It was part of the text. But for this one, there is something better than an omen list, and it deserves real weight, because it shows you what the whole idea felt like from the inside of the culture, rather than from the filing cabinet. Go to the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 1, available to you in English in the translations of Andrew George or of Benjamin Foster, and either will do you well. Near the beginning, the gods make a man to be Gilgamesh's counterweight, and they do not make him in a city. They make him out in the steppe, in the open country, away from every human thing. His name is Enkidu, and the way the poem introduces him to you is not through his deeds and not through his lineage. It is through his surface. He is covered in hair. His body is shaggy. His hair grows long, and thick. He is described in the terms you would use for an animal, and he lives with the animals, and he eats grass with the gazelles, and drinks at the waterhole with the herd. You are not being told a grooming fact. You are being handed a reading. The poem is telling you what Enkidu is before it tells you anything he does, and it is doing it entirely through the covering of his body, and it expects you to understand instantly. In that literature, the body's surface is a status text. It says where a person stands in the order of things, wild or settled, beast or man, outside the city or inside it, and it says so before the person opens their mouth. You can read a man's place off him at a distance. And then look at what happens to Enkidu. He is brought into the human world, civilized, socialized, taught to eat bread and drink beer and wear cloth. And part of what changes in the poem is his body. The surface is edited to match the new status, which means the epic is not only saying that the body is a document, it is saying that the document can be rewritten. That is an extraordinary thing for a text that old to understand, and it is the reason I did not want to skip past it. Now, the mainstream reading, at full strength, and it is short because it is not complicated. The hair omens are divination, produced by the same list-making machine as everything else in this corpus, expanded by permutation, with no observational basis at all. And Enkidu is literature. He is a poetic figure in a work of imaginative narrative art, built to carry a theme about wildness and civilization, and the hair is a symbol doing symbolic work. To read either of those as a biological observation is a category error of the crudest kind. A poet describing a wild man as hairy is not reporting a finding. Anybody who tells you otherwise is selling something. That criticism is correct, and I accept it whole. So, again, the premise, not the reading. In 2003, in the journal Genetics, Amar Klar published a proposal about the very spot your fingers are resting on. The direction of the crown hair whorl, whether it spirals clockwise or counterclockwise as it comes out of the scalp, was proposed to be related to handedness, and behind-handedness, to the lateralization of the brain itself. Follow the logic carefully, because the logic is genuinely elegant, even if the finding is shaky. The human body is not symmetrical. It looks roughly symmetrical from the front, but it is not. And the asymmetry is not decorative. The heart sits to one side, the liver to the other. The lungs have different numbers of lobes, and this arrangement is established extremely early in development by a real, well-studied mechanism that breaks the embryo's left-right symmetry, and then propagates that decision through everything that follows. The brain is asymmetrical too, in a deep and functional way. Language is typically weighted to one hemisphere and not the other, and hand preference goes with that weighting, and the whorl on your scalp is a chirality as well, a handedness of tissue, a spiral that had to be set in one direction rather than the other, and it is set early, in the same developmental period. Klar's argument was that if a single underlying factor is setting the body's chirality, then the whorl, which is out in the open, on the visible surface, requiring no equipment to read, would be a window onto the asymmetry inside the skull, which is invisible and requires a great deal of equipment, a visible mark that reports on a hidden structure. That is the exact same shape as the ancient premise, arrived at from the other end, 3,000 years later, in a genetics journal. And now I am going to flag it, because I told you at the top of this video that I would tell you when I am standing on soft ground, and this is soft ground. This one is disputed. Replication has been mixed at best. Several later studies looked for the relationship between whorl direction and handedness, and found nothing reliable. The samples in this area are generally small. Scoring the whorl is not as clean as it sounds. A meaningful number of people have whorls that are not clearly clockwise or counterclockwise. Some have 2 whorls, Some have a whorl that reads differently depending on the angle you're looking from and how the hair is cut, and a measurement that depends on a judgment call by an observer will drift. So I am presenting this to you as an unresolved and probably weak claim, not as a fact. I do not think you should walk away from this item believing that the top of your head predicts which hand you write with. I am not going to oversell it, and if anyone else does, that is on them. So what survives here, and I will keep it narrow again, not the fortune telling. What survives is the thing underneath, and it is completely uncontested. The human body is asymmetric by construction. It was built asymmetric on purpose by a mechanism that operates in the first weeks after conception, and that has been studied in detail. That asymmetry is not confined to the organs you cannot see. The same decision that put your heart where it is also runs out to the surface, and it is expressed on the outside of you as well as the inside of you, and it is expressed in your skull as well as your chest. The body's left and its right are not the same body, and they never were. And that was settled before you had a face. The hair on the crown of your head grows in a direction that was decided before you were born. So finish this half with me properly. Get someone to photograph the top of your head, or hold a phone above you and shoot down, or use 2 mirrors if you are alone. Actually do it. Then look at the picture and note the direction of the spiral, clockwise or counterclockwise as you look down at yourself from above. Write it down somewhere, if you like. And then let me be honest with you about what you now know, because I am not going to end an item by lying. It almost certainly does not predict anything about you. It does not tell you your handedness with any reliability. It does not tell you about your brain. It does not tell you about your talents or your temperament, and anyone who reads your character off the back of your head is doing a party trick. The interesting thing was never the prediction. The interesting thing is the other part. That direction was set in the womb by a process that had already finished its work before you were the size of a thumb, and you have carried it every day of your life since. Through every haircut, through every photograph anybody has ever taken of you from behind. Every person who has ever stood behind you in a queue has looked directly at it. Your barber knows it by heart and works around it. Your mother has seen it 10,000 times. And unless you did what I just asked, you have never seen it. They wrote it on the body, and it is still written there. Now stop for a moment, because everything changes from here. Look back at what we have covered. Every single mark on this list so far, the moles, the creases, the ridges on your fingertips, the proportions of your face, the mark in your throat, the spiral on your crown, has been one of 2 things. It came to you from your parents, in the deal that was struck at the moment you were conceived. Or it came out of the ordinary business of a body building itself. Hormones in a window, tissue folding, growth doing what growth does, inheritance, or development. That is the whole set. Those marks are, in the deepest sense, not events. They are just what happens when a human being is assembled from the standard plan, and every human being who has ever lived carries some version of them. The next one is not like that. The next one did not come from your mother, and it did not come from your father. It is not in the plan. It is not something a body does on the way to being finished. It is something that happened, a specific event, at a specific moment, to a specific small group of cells, after you had already begun, in a body that was already yours. It is written on the outside, in color, where anybody can see it. There is an ancient series devoted entirely to marks of exactly that kind, and it is the most notorious series in the whole corpus. And the ancient scholars did not treat it as an ordinary mark at all. They treated it as a message, and the modern medicine that explains it was not published until 2013, and when I tell you what it says, you are going to understand why I put this item at number 9 instead of number 1. This is the reason this video exists. Before I take you into the 9th one, I am going to ask you for something once, and then I will not ask again. Work like this. Work that goes to the additions, that names the scholar and the year, that gives the other side its full strength before it turns, does not travel on its own. The machine that put this in front of you rewards speed and volume and noise, and 3 hours of careful sourced argument is exactly the shape of thing it buries. The only thing that carries a video like this is a subscription. So if you have come this far, and you mean to stay for the rest of it, subscribe. That is the whole ask. It costs you nothing, and it is the difference between this work continuing and this work quietly stopping. Now, look at your own body again, and this time, look for something different. Not the moles you counted, not the crease in your palm, not the whorl at the back of your head. I want the mark that does not belong to anybody else in your family. The patch of color on a shoulder or a thigh or the back of a calf that your mother did not have and your father did not have and your brother does not have. The one that was there when you arrived. The one that, if you ever asked about it as a child, got an answer that was not really an answer, because nobody in the room actually knew. Everything on this list until now has been about marks that came from somewhere. Your moles came from your parents' skin type, and your grandmother's coloring, and the summers you spent outdoors. Your palm crease came from the way a hand folds in the womb. Your fingerprints came from the mechanics of skin under tension in the 10th to 16th week. Your hair whorl came from the geometry of a growing scalp. Every one of those is inheritance or ordinary development. Every one of those came from your parents or from the plain physics of a body being built. The 9th one did not come from anywhere. And that is why it is here. And that is why it is 9th. And that is why the title of this video points at it. The tablet series is called Shuma Izbu, which is said Shuma Izbu. In the standard reconstruction, it runs to 24 tablets. The critical edition, the one that gathered the fragments and made the series legible to the modern world, was published by Erla Leichty in 1970. And if you go looking for this material in English, that is the edition everything else stands on. In more recent years, the series has been treated at length by Nikla Dzorzy, who has worked on how the omen lists are actually organized, on the internal logic and the associative patterning that runs through them. Leichty gave us the text. Dzorzy has been asking how the minds that made it were working. And I have to tell you what the series is about. And I am going to do it carefully because of what it is about. Shuma Izbu is a compendium of omens drawn from anomalous births. Most of it concerns animals. The ewe, the goat, the cow, the sow. Because in an agricultural civilization, animals are born constantly and in numbers, and a scribe who wants a large sample of unusual births has one available to him every season. But the series does not stop at animals. Part of it concerns human infants. Children born with visible physical differences. I want to be plain about what that means before I say another word about tablets and editors, because it would be very easy to talk about this the way scholarship sometimes has to talk about it, at a clinical distance, as a category of source material. These were real children. They were born to real women who had carried them and waited for them. They had faces. Most of them did not live long, in a world with no medicine to speak of, and the ones who did lived under a shadow they did not choose. So here's how I am going to handle this item. I am not going to be flippant. I am not going to describe a single condition for shock value. And if you came for that, this is not going to be that. And I am going to talk about those infants the way I would want a stranger to talk about my own child. If that makes this item slower and quieter than the 8 before it, then it is slower and quieter, and I would rather lose the pace than lose the decency. Because the honest description of what the Babylonian scribes were doing here is that it was cruel. Not cruel in intent, most of the time, but cruel in effect and cruel in structure. They took the body of a newborn who had been born different, and they read it as a public message, not as a private grief, as a message, and typically not even a message about the child or about the mother, but about the king, about the city, about the harvest, about whether the enemy would come. A family's worst day was converted into a data point about the state. And now, let me tell you the other half of it, because it is the half that gets left out, and it is the half that makes these people human rather than monstrous. They were terrified. Understand the position they were standing in. A child arrives, and the child is different in a way nobody in the village has seen, and there is no explanation available. None. Not a bad one. Not a wrong one. Nothing. There is no cell, no gene, no chromosome, no developmental biology, not even the concept of a mechanism. There is only the overwhelming fact of it. And a human mind cannot sit with an overwhelming fact that has no frame around it. So they built a frame. They said, this is writing. This is the God speaking. And if it is speaking, then it can be read. And if it can be read, then it can be prepared for. And if it can be prepared for, then we are not simply helpless. The Omen List is a terrified civilization manufacturing the feeling of control. That is what almost all divination is. Everywhere, in every culture, including several that are still going. And here is the object I want you to hold in your mind for this whole item, because it says everything the tablets do not. Among the surviving material from this world are amulets, things worn, things hung over a bed, things carried, against a figure called Lamashtu, said La Mashtu, who was believed to take infants. That is the one and only demon I am going to name in this video, and I am naming her for a reason. Strip the theology out of that object and look at what it physically is. It is a thing a mother wore because her baby might die, and she could not stop it. It is the exact same object as the small charm a frightened parent buys today at 3 in the morning, in a different century and a different alphabet. Somebody made that amulet. Somebody paid for it. Somebody put it on and touched it during the night. 4,000 years is nothing at all when you are looking at that. So, cruel system, terrified people, frightened mothers doing the only thing available to them. All three of those are true at once, and I am not going to flatten any of them. Now, the point I actually need from the ancient material, and it is not the omens themselves. Every other mark in this video is a mark with a source you can point at. The Shuma Izbu system is built around a different category entirely, and the category is the thing that matters. It is the mark that no one chose, the mark no parent gave, the mark that appeared on one body and on no other body, that ran in no family line, that could not be traced backwards to anybody, and that therefore, in their framework, must have been placed. Because in their world, if a thing has no earthly origin, then by definition, it has an unearthly one. A mark that comes from nowhere is a mark that comes from the gods. Hold that category. The mark that came from nowhere. That is the ancient half of item 9. And give the mainstream its full strength here, because it is right about all of it. Shuma Izbu is not embryology. It is not a lost medical text. The scribes were not investigating causes. They had no interest in causes. Large stretches of the series are generated by the same combinatorial logic you have heard me describe all night. If this side, then that side. If 2 of a thing, then 3 of a thing. And many of the cases listed almost certainly never occurred in anyone's experience. The apodices, the outcomes, are dominated by kings and armies and grain, which tells you the social function of the whole enterprise. This was scholarship for a palace. Every specific reading in those 24 tablets is wrong. All of them, not most. All of them. The readings failed. Now watch what happens to the premise. In 2013, in the New England Journal of Medicine, Shirley and colleagues published a paper about a mark that most people have seen and almost nobody understands. The port wine stain. A flat patch of deep red or purple coloring, usually present at birth, most often on the face or the neck. Permanent, and in some people associated with a condition called Sturge-Weber syndrome, which involves the blood vessels of the brain and eye, as well as the skin. What they found was the cause, and the cause is a single mutation, one letter changed in one gene, a gene called GNAQ. But the important part is not which gene. The important part is when and in which cell, and I am going to walk through this slowly, because it is the center of this entire video, and I do not want a single person listening to miss it. You began as one cell. One. That cell divided into two. Those two divided into four, and four into eight, and on and on. And every cell in your body today, every neuron, every bone cell, every cell in the skin of your hands, is descended by direct copying from that one original cell. Each division involves copying about 3 billion letters of code, and copying is not perfect. It is extraordinarily good, better than any machine we have built, but it is not perfect. So somewhere in that cascade, after conception, after you already existed, in one cell among a growing crowd of them, a single letter got copied wrong. Not in the egg, not in the sperm, not in the instructions your parents handed over. In you, after the fact, during construction, that one cell kept dividing, and every cell descended from it carries the error, because copying an error copies the error, and no other cell in your body carries it, because no other cell descends from that one. What you get is a patch, a population of cells with a different text from the cells beside them, occupying a territory on the body determined entirely by where that one cell happened to be sitting when the mistake happened, and how its descendants migrated afterwards. That is a somatic mutation. Somatic, meaning of the body, as opposed to germline, meaning of the inherited line. And this is the sentence the title of this video is built on, so I am going to say it several ways until it is properly lodged. That mark is not in your mother. She does not have it, and she never did. It is not in your father. It is not in the code he passed you. It is not in your brother or your sister, even the sibling who looks exactly like you, because they were built from a different first cell, and that particular error happened in yours. It cannot be inherited from anybody, by anyone, ever, because it did not exist until after the moment you were conceived. There was no previous carrier. There is no line it came down. It has no ancestors. It is a mark written onto one body and onto no other body that has ever existed in the history of this species. It began with you. In the strictest possible sense, it came from nowhere. Now, the honesty clause, and I want to be exact about this because somebody will otherwise go into the comments and accuse me of inflating, and they would be entitled to. The port wine stain is not common. It is uncommon. It occurs in something on the order of 3 in every 1,000 newborns, a fraction of 1%. Sturge-Weber is rarer still. If I told you the 9th thing on this list was on most people and I meant that specific mark, I would be lying to you, and you would be right to switch this off. That is not what I am telling you. Listen to what the finding actually is. The mechanism is universal, not the syndrome. The mechanism. Every adult human body is a mosaic. That is not a metaphor, and it is not a fringe position. It is the settled modern picture. You are not one genome walking around in a suit of identical cells. You are a patchwork of cell lineages that are not genetically identical to one another, because errors accumulate from the very first divisions onward and never stop accumulating. Some of those lineages diverged in the first week of your existence and now occupy whole regions of you. Others diverged last year in a patch of skin the size of a coin. Your body is a family tree of cells with mutations marking the branches, and the branches are still splitting while you sit there listening to me. And most of the visible marks people carry are the surface expression of exactly that process. The ordinary mole, which is a clone, a colony of pigment cells descended from one ancestor cell that acquired a change and multiplied. The cafe au lait patch, a large share of the things people call birthmarks. Different mutations, different genes, different sizes, different ages, but the same underlying event every time. A copying error in one cell, after conception, inherited by that cell's descendants and by nobody else. So here's the ninth thing, and here is what the title of this video was promising you. Somewhere on your body is a mark that no parent gave you. Not a trait you got from your mother's side. Not a family resemblance. Not a thing that runs in the line. A mark that arose in you from an error in one cell during your construction that belongs to you and to nobody else who has ever lived, and that will not be passed on to your children either, because it is not in the code you hand over. It stops with the body it started in. It is unique in the way a fingerprint is only pretending to be unique. Look at it, whichever one it is. That is a message with no sender and no recipient, written on you, that you have carried your whole life and never once been able to explain. And the Babylonians had a category for that. Not the right explanation, a category. They had a slot in their system for the mark that came from nowhere. And they said, something wrote that. They were wrong about who. They were not wrong that it was written, and they were not wrong that it came from outside anything a family could account for. Now I am going to do the thing I promised at the top of this video, which is to bring you the piece of this that the field rejects, and to give you both halves of it honestly, and then to leave it entirely with you. In 1997, a psychiatrist named Ian Stevenson published a 2-volume work called Reincarnation and Biology. Stevenson was not a fringe figure by credential. He was a professor at the University of Virginia. He had held a departmental chair. He published in peer-reviewed journals. And he spent several decades of a serious professional life on this. The work concerns children, most of them very young, who claim to remember a previous life. And specifically, it concerns a subset of those cases in which the child had a birthmark or a physical deformity that corresponded to a wound, often a fatal wound, described in the life the child claimed to remember. In some of those cases, Stevenson obtained documentation, medical records, and in a number of instances, post-mortem reports, which he used to compare the location of the child's mark against the recorded location of the injury. That is the real half. A real man, real credentials, decades of fieldwork, thousands of pages, and in some cases, genuine documents rather than family testimony. Now the other half, and I am giving it at full strength because it deserves full strength. Mainstream science does not accept this, and it does not accept it for good reasons. The cases were collected retrospectively. The mark was already there, and the story was already told before any investigator arrived, which means the connection between them had usually been made by the family long before it was ever examined. Much of the work was conducted through interpreters, in cultures where reincarnation is an ordinary and expected belief, which introduces both translation drift and strong prior expectation on all sides. Birthmarks are extremely common. You have several, and so does everyone you know. So if you are looking for a correspondence between a mark somewhere on a body and a wound somewhere on another body, chance alone will hand you matches at a rate that feels impressive and is not. And the whole method is vulnerable at the point of selection. Which cases got investigated? Which got written up? Which got set aside? And how much the interviewer's own expectation shaped what the child and the family produced under questioning. Those are not cheap objections. They are the objections you would raise about any body of evidence built this way, in any field, and they have not been answered. So I am not endorsing it. I want that on the record. I do not think Stevenson demonstrated what he believed he demonstrated, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to make this item land harder than it should. But I am also not going to sneer at him, and I am not going to leave him out. Because here's what is actually true. A real man did real work over a real career on a question the rest of the field would not touch, and the field rejected it. And both of those facts are part of the record. You are an adult. You have now heard both halves from me rather than from somebody selling you one of them. Do with it exactly what you want. And now I want to say the thing this whole video has been building toward. Once, plainly, and then move on. Any one of these you can wave away. Take any single item on this list, on its own, and there is a perfectly good reason it proves nothing. There are 12. They come in an order, and somewhere around the 9th, the waving away stops working. So do this before we go on. Find it. The mark on your body that nobody else in your family has. The one that was never explained. The one that got a shrug when you asked. The one that came from nowhere. Put your hand on it if you can reach it, or go and look in a mirror if you cannot. And now you know what it actually is. It is a copying error made in one cell during the weeks you were being assembled, inherited by every cell descended from that one, and by not a single other cell in your body. It is not from your mother. It is not from your father. It is yours alone. It did not exist before you did, and it will not outlive you. It is the only sentence in the universe written in that exact place, on that exact body. They had no idea what caused it. They were wrong about every specific thing they said it meant. But they looked at a mark that came from nowhere, and they said, that was not inherited. That was placed, and it belongs to this one person and to no one else. And that, mechanically, structurally, is correct. They wrote it on the body, and the body is still carrying it, and it will carry it until the day it stops. And then that particular sentence goes out of existence for good. Now stay with me, because the 10th one changes what this list is doing. Everything up to here has been about what a mark on your body was supposed to mean. The 10th one is about what a mark on your body was allowed to cost you. Not in fortune. Not in reputation. In access to a room, to an altar, to a profession, to the presence of a god. And when I show you where else that exact rule turns up, some of you are going to recognize it immediately, because you grew up hearing it read aloud. Look at your own hands and arms for one more moment. Find a scar. Everybody has one. The old white line on a knuckle, the mark from the stitches you got as a child, the burn from a kitchen, the place a dog got you, the surgical seam that never quite faded. Or find a birthmark somewhere visible, or the eye that has never been quite as good as the other one. In two ancient civilizations, that thing you are looking at right now would have closed a door in your life. Permanently. Not a social door. A sacred one. The text is the Enmaduranki text, said Enmeduranki, and the treatment I am pointing you at is by W.G. Lambert in his study of the qualifications of Babylonian diviners, published in 1998. Lambert is one of the great names in this field, and the piece does exactly what its title says. It lays out what a man had to be in order to be permitted to do this work. The professional in question is the Baru, said Baru, the diviner. And I want you to understand what this man was, because our word diviner does him no justice at all and makes him sound like a fortune teller at a fair. The Baru was a highly trained technical specialist at the top of a scholarly profession. He was the man who inspected the liver of a sacrificed animal and read the state of the god's intentions from it. He was consulted before military campaigns. He was consulted about the health of the king, about building projects, about appointments, about whether a course of action would end well. He was, functionally, the intelligence service of a state that believed the future was written down somewhere and could be read by someone qualified to read it. He was as close to the gods as a professional man could get, and the qualifications for that role, as the text sets them out, were of two kinds. The first was descent. You had to be of the right line, pure descent, the son of the right kind of father, out of the right family. That part will not surprise anybody. Ancient professions were largely hereditary, and the priesthood especially so. It is the second requirement that stops you. He had to be perfect in body and limb, sound, unblemished. A defect in the body disqualified the man. Sit with what that meant to an actual life. Picture a boy in the right family. His father is a Baru. His grandfather was a Baru. The tablets are in the house. The training is his birthright. The entire arc of his life is laid out in front of him from birth, and it is a good arc. Status, income, proximity to the palace, a place in the most prestigious scholarly tradition his civilization has. And he has a mark, a withered hand, a crooked leg, a cloudy eye, a birthmark across the face. Something that happened to him at 6 years old and never healed straight. And that is the end of it. Not the end of his life, and not the end of his standing in the community. I want to be careful here, because this was not exclusion from society. It was exclusion from the sanctuary. He could not do the thing his blood entitled him to do. He could not stand in the place where the reading happened, and the disqualification was permanent, because a body does not unmark itself, and it was physical, so there was no appeal, no argument, no examination he could pass, and it was public, because everyone could see the reason walking around on him. He would spend his whole life among people who knew precisely which door had been shut, and precisely why. Now let me give you the mainstream explanation of that, and let me give it at full strength, because it is strong, and because it is the single best objection to everything I'm about to say next. Ritual purity requirements involving physical wholeness are close to universal in ancient religion. They are not a Mesopotamian peculiarity, and they are not a Hebrew peculiarity. They fall straight out of the internal logic of sacrifice, which runs like this. What you bring to a god must be unblemished. The animal must be without defect. The offering must be whole. The vessel must be undamaged. And once that logic exists for the offering, it extends by the plainest possible reasoning to the man who carries the offering, because a flawed vessel and a flawed bearer are the same category of problem inside that system. You do not need any transmission story to explain two neighboring cultures, both arriving at this. You need only the idea that the divine receives perfection, and every culture that sacrifices has that idea. This is convergence, not inheritance, and any historian would tell you so. That objection has real force. I think it is largely right. Hold it in your hand while I read you the next thing. Leviticus chapter 21, verses 16 to 23. The passage sets out that no descendant of Aaron, no man of the priestly line, who has a blemish may approach to offer. It then gives a list of physical conditions and defects that constitute such a blemish: blindness, lameness, disfigurement, a limb malformed or broken, and further conditions of the body and the eyes and the skin. Such a man may not come near the veil or approach the altar to make the offering. And then it does something that people who have only heard the passage summarized usually do not know. It explicitly permits him to eat of the holy food, including the most holy. He remains a priest. He remains of the line. He is fed from the offerings. He simply may not approach. I am not going to put a fabricated quotation in your ear, so go and read it for yourself. It takes 90 seconds, and it is exactly where I said it is. Now look at the two rules side by side. Same institution, the hereditary priesthood, same qualification structure, right descent, and physical wholeness, both required. Same disqualifying category, a mark on the body, whether you were born with it or acquired it. Same nature of the penalty, permanent, physical, public, and non-negotiable, and the same striking limitation on the penalty in both traditions. It bars you from approach, not from belonging, and the Mesopotamian material is older. That is not a claim, it is a date. The Babylonian scholarly tradition, setting out the qualifications of the diviner, is attested in a scribal tradition that predates the composition of the priestly material in Leviticus. Here I am going to flag exactly what I am doing, because this is the most sensitive moment in this entire video, and you deserve to see my hands. I am not claiming direct copying. I am not telling you that a Hebrew scribe sat down with a Babylonian tablet and transcribed a rule out of it. There is no evidence of that. I do not believe it, and anyone who tells you it is proven is going beyond what anybody can show. That is the interpretive bridge in this item, and I am naming it out loud rather than sliding it past you. The connection between these two bodies of material is an inference about a shared cultural world, not a documented act of transmission. What I am saying is narrower and, I think, harder to put down. If you were raised on that passage, and a great many people listening to me right now you were probably taught that this rule came from Sinai and from nowhere else, that it was given whole and new out of the mouth of God to one people at one moment. And what the tablets show is that the rule has an older attested ancestor, the same rule with the same logic, governing the same kind of institution, written down in a Babylonian scribal tradition before the priestly material of Leviticus was composed. Whether the older text influenced the later one directly, or whether both drew from a common ancient Near Eastern instinct about purity and approach, is a question historians will keep arguing. But if you were taught that the rule began at Sinai, you were taught something incomplete. I say that without any contempt for anyone's faith. And I mean that. A rule having a history does not make it empty. Every law has ancestors, and a great many people would say the fact that a truth was already circulating in the world is not an argument against where they believe it ultimately came from. That is a theological question, and it is not mine to settle. I am telling you what is in the ground. The tablets are older. The scripture inherited the rule. And now, the human weight of it, which is the part I actually want you to leave with. In both civilizations, the one with the sacrificed sheep and the reed pen, and the one with the altar and the veil, the question of whether a man could stand in the holy place was decided by the surface of his body, not by what he knew, not by what he had studied, not by his devotion, his intelligence, his conduct, or his desire. By what could be seen on him. The most consequential document about that man's entire life was his skin, and he did not write a word of it. It was written on him during construction, or written on him by an accident when he was 7 years old, and then it was read by other men, and it decided where he was permitted to stand for the next 50 years. So do this one before we move on, and take it seriously. Find the mark that would have disqualified you. Everybody has one. The scar on your hand, the eye that has never been right, the knee that sets wrong, the birthmark somebody once made a comment about at school, the finger that healed crooked. Look at it and understand that in two ancient civilizations, on two sides of a desert, separated by centuries, that exact thing would have closed a door to you for life, and that nobody would have thought it unjust, and that there would have been nothing whatsoever you could do about it. They wrote it on the body, and it has not stopped being true. And now, hold on to that, because the 11th one turns it inside out. If a mark on your body could bar you from the gods, then a mark on your body could also assign you to them. Not exclude you, claim you. There is a category of person in this world whose relationship to a temple was recorded on their skin, permanently and deliberately, by somebody else's hand, not as a worshiper, as property. And what was done to them, and where it was done, and what it was for, is going to sound extremely familiar to anyone who has been through an airport recently. So there was a mark that could stand between a man and his God. A mark that could take a body that was otherwise whole and healthy and strong and quietly move it to the wrong side of a doorway forever, with no appeal and no explanation. That was the last one. Now I want you to sit with the other half of that idea, because it is worse, and because it is still running. If a mark could keep you out, a mark could also assign you, not exclude you, assign you. Put your body on the inventory of a household that was not yours, under the seal of a god, permanently, and in a place on your body where you would see it every single hour that you were awake. Look at the back of your left hand, right now. Not the palm, I will get to the palm in a moment. The back of the hand, the tendons, the space between the base of the thumb and the base of the first finger, and then the inside of the wrist where the skin goes pale and thin and the veins come up close to the surface. Look at that patch of yourself. Hold it there while I explain why the Babylonians looked at exactly that patch, and why hundreds of millions of people alive tonight are, in a sense that is not a metaphor and not an exaggeration, still being looked at in exactly that place. Start with the stones, because the stones set up the whole logic, and without them, the rest of this sounds like a horror story instead of an administrative system. Mesopotamia produced an object that scholars call the kuduru, which is said ku-du-ru. They are stones. Boundary stones is the usual English name for them, and that name is only roughly right, but hold on to the picture. A shaped block of hard stone, usually rounded at the top, sometimes the size of a milestone, carved on every available surface. What is carved on them is two things at once, and the combination is the entire point. The first thing carved on them is a record, a grant of land. This field, of this size, in this district, with these neighbors on these four sides, given by this authority to this man and to his descendants after him. It is an ownership document. It is a deed. It is, in function, the thing you keep in a fireproof box. The second thing carved on them is the gods, symbols of them, emblems, arranged in registers around the stone, each one standing for a specific deity, a whole assembly of them ranked across the surface of the rock, and underneath, running around the stone in bands, the curse formulae, long ones, elaborate ones, formulae directed at any person in any future generation who moves this stone, breaks this stone, defaces this stone, erases this writing, replaces this name with another name, or throws it in the river. May this god do this to him. May that god do that to his seed. On and on, deity after deity, each one taking a turn. I want you to see what that object actually is, structurally, because it is the seed of everything else in this item. It is a mark. It is a sign cut into a permanent surface. And the reason it is cut into a permanent surface, rather than written on a tablet in a cupboard, is that the surface itself is the guarantee. You cannot argue with the stone. You cannot claim you never saw the stone. And the curses are there to make the mark self-enforcing, because the ancient authority understood perfectly well that a record is only as good as the fear attached to tampering with it. So they attached gods to it. Possession is recorded by an inscribed sign, and the sign is witnessed by the divine assembly, and the sign is placed where it cannot be quietly removed. Now transfer that logic off the rock. In the Neo-Babylonian period, and the documentation for this is thickest in the enormous temple archive at Uruk, the archive of the Eanna, there was an institution that modern scholarship calls the Shirkutu. The person it defined was called a Shirku, which is said Shirku. A Shirku was a temple dependent, a person belonging to a temple. Not a slave in the narrow chattel sense that an English speaker imports from a different continent and a different century, and not a free hired man either. Something with its own legal shape. A human being who was attached to a god's household, who could be assigned work, who appears in the accounts, who is administered. And a shirku could be marked on the hand or on the wrist with a star. The star is associated with the goddess Ishtar. That association is not controversial. The scholarly treatment that people reach for on this material is Muhammad Dandamayev in his book Slavery in Babylonia, 1984. And if you want to go and read the primary discussion, rather than take my word for it, that is where you start. Now, I am going to do something here that most channels working this material will not do, and I want you to notice me doing it, because it is the difference between a script that survives contact with an expert and a script that does not. I do not know what the mark looked like. Nobody watching this does, and more to the point, the specialists do not agree either. The precise symbol and the precise method are debated in the literature. So I am going to say a star associated with Ishtar, and I am going to stop there. I am not going to tell you how many points it had, because the sources do not hand me that, and I would only be decorating. I am not going to tell you whether it was branded with heat, or tattooed with pigment, or incised with a blade, because the terminology in the texts has been read more than one way, by more than one competent scholar, and the honest position is that it is contested. I am deliberately leaving the picture unfinished. I want to be exact about why. Filling in that picture is precisely how a channel like this one gets caught. It is the easiest thing in the world to say the words, "a 9-pointed star burned into the flesh," and watch the room go quiet, and it costs nothing on the night and everything afterwards, because it is not in the evidence, and someone who has read the evidence is watching. The unfinished picture is the trustworthy one. Take the blur as a feature. Here is what is solid, and it is solid enough that it does not need any decoration at all. In Neo-Babylonian Uruk, a permanent mark placed on a person's hand or wrist recorded that this person belonged to an institution. Read that again slowly, because every word in it is load-bearing, permanent, on the hand or the wrist, recording belonging to an institution. That is the Kuduru logic taken off the stone and put onto skin. The body has become the surface that the record is cut into. The body is the ledger, and the ledger is placed on the one part of a person that they cannot avoid seeing. Not the back, not the scalp, not the sole of a foot, but the hand. The thing that comes up in front of your eyes several thousand times a day, the thing you eat with and work with and wash and hold out to another person. A human being carrying their own registration on the part of themselves They look at more than any other. Now I hand the microphone to the mainstream, and I hand it over completely, because on this one the mainstream is simply correct. There is nothing mystical here. Marking dependent people is grimly ordinary across ancient societies and across later ones. Many cultures, many centuries, many continents did some version of this to some category of person, and the practice requires no special explanation at all. It is not evidence of hidden knowledge. It is evidence of bookkeeping. What the Shirkutu material actually tells a historian about is the economics of a large temple household, how a major institution in Uruk organized labor, how it tracked people who were assigned to it, how it protected its claim against a neighboring household or a family trying to reabsorb someone. The star is an accounting mark under a divine brand. It is administration. It is the same impulse that produces the stone in the field, applied to a person instead of a boundary, and it is squalid rather than occult. Give that its full weight. I am not going to argue with any of it. I think it is right. I am going to argue with something else. I am going to argue that the institution did not end. It changed medium. Because here is what actually happened to that idea over the following 2,500 years. The star went away. The temple went away. The goddess went away. The question did not. The question is, who does this person belong to? And how do we know? And what stops them from claiming to be someone else? And in our own century, at a scale the Iana could not have imagined, the answer we have arrived at is the body. Not a card, which can be lost. Not a name, which can be shared or changed. Not a signature, which can be copied. The body. National identity registration built on biometrics. Fingerprints, iris patterns, the geometry of a face. Enrolling hundreds of millions of people in more than one country into databases that decide whether a given human being is entitled to a payment, a ration, a bank account, a phone number, a job, a border crossing. I want to be careful and measured here, and I want to be nonpartisan. And I am not going to name a single program or a single company, because the second you do that, this stops being an argument about structure and becomes an argument about politics. And the structure is the interesting part. I am also not going to tell you these systems are evil. Plenty of them were built by people trying to solve a real and serious problem, which is that a person with no provable identity is a person who can be denied everything. And biometric enrollment has genuinely given millions of people a way to prove they exist. That is not nothing. That is the strongest possible case for it, and I have just made it for you. But look at the shape. Once again, the body is the place where belonging is recorded. Once again, the record is meant to be permanent and non-transferable, which is the entire selling point. Once again, the mark is taken from the hand. And I want you to notice that our own biometric century went straight back to the fingers and the palm and the eye, the same small inventory of surfaces the Mesopotamians were reading, which is not a coincidence. It is that there are only so many places on a human being that are stable and visible and unique. And once again, and this is the part that matters, the person carrying the mark does not hold the record. They carry the sign. Somebody else keeps the tablet. That is the sentence I want you to leave this item with. The difference between the Shirku in Uruk and the modern citizen is not whether the body carries the mark. Both bodies carry the mark. The difference is who holds the tablet. The star was visible and ours is not, and I think we have quietly mistaken that for progress. A visible mark at least tells you that you have been marked. Ours does not. Ours is a number extracted from the ridges of your fingers and the pattern in your iris and stored somewhere you have never been, in a building you could not find, under an authority you did not personally agree to, and the only thing that has really changed since Uruk is that you can no longer see it on your hand. So do this now, and then do something for me. Look at the back of your left hand, and then turn it, and look at the inside of your left wrist. Those exact two places. The places named in the ancient material. And find what is actually there. Everyone has something. A freckle sitting on its own, out on the back of the hand. A mole near the base of the thumb. A small white scar you got at 9 years old and cannot now remember getting. A raised vein that runs at an angle across the wrist and that no other person alive has in quite that path. A birthmark. A pale patch. Something. Whatever it is, tell me in the comments. Just that. What is on your left hand? Say where it is, and what it is, and how long you have had it. And if you have no idea where it came from, say that too, because that is the interesting category. I read them, and I am asking on purpose, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand that the thing on the back of your left hand is not decoration, and it is not random, and it may well be the only visible edge of something much larger that is drawn across the whole of you. They wrote it on the body, and the body is still carrying it. Which brings me to the last one, and I have saved it deliberately, because the last one is not a mark you can go and find. You cannot check it in a mirror. You cannot count it. It has no color and no border, and it is not on some people and absent in others. It is a map. It is on every single person listening to my voice, without exception, covering you from your scalp to the soles of your feet, laid down before you were born. And you have never seen it. Almost certainly, you never will. Let me start with the most sophisticated document in the entire corpus, and I mean that seriously. Everything else I have shown you tonight has been, in one way or another, a list. This one is a method. It is called the Sakiku, which is said Sakiku, and which is sometimes written in the literature as SA.GIG. 40 tablets. A diagnostic and prognostic handbook. The modern critical edition is the work of Niels Hiesel in the year 2000, and the material is treated at length by Joanne Scurlock in 2014. Its editorship, the act of gathering and ordering and standardizing the whole series into the form we have, is credited to Esagilkin Apli, which is said Esagilkin Apili. Credited. As with everything associated with that name, I say credited rather than proven, because the tradition attaches him to it, and I am not going to upgrade a tradition into a documentary fact. Now let me tell you what this thing actually was, because if I just say a Babylonian medical text, you will picture something quaint, and you will be badly wrong. Picture a man walking through a city to a house where somebody is ill. He has been sent for. He is a trained specialist, and he belongs to a scholarly tradition with a written curriculum behind it. And the examination begins the moment he leaves his own door, because the series takes account of what he observes on the way, what he encounters in the street, what crosses his path, the circumstances of the approach. That is not medicine as we understand it, and I will come back to that. But notice what it says about the model. The case begins before he sees the patient, because the whole world is being read as a continuous surface of signs, and the sick body is only the densest part of it. Then he arrives, and he examines the body in a fixed order, from the head downward, the top of the skull, the hair, the forehead, the temples, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, the neck, and down through the trunk and the limbs to the feet. Systematically, in sequence, every region in the same order, every time. And what he is doing at each station is reading the surface as the index of something invisible. The color of the skin here, the temperature under the hand there, the state of the eye, the pattern of sweating, the way the patient holds a limb, whether a sign appeared on the first day or the third or the seventh. And out of the accumulation of those surface observations, he is producing two things, a name for the invisible cause, and a forecast. The name for the cause is often a phrase built on the words Kot Eli, which is said Kot Li, the hand of a god. Whose hand is on this patient? Which specific invisible agency has taken hold of this specific person, as evidenced by this specific pattern of signs on the outside? And the forecast is the second half. He will recover. He will not recover. He will suffer for this many days, and then the fever will break. This case is beyond treatment. Sit with the architecture of that for a second, because it is genuinely brilliant, and it is not the brilliance people expect. The claim underneath the Sakiku is this: the visible surface of a body is the readable index of an invisible interior process. That is it. That is the whole idea. You cannot see inside the man. You will never see inside the man. But the outside of him is not a blank wall. It is a display. And the display is systematically related to the thing you cannot see. And therefore a trained reader, working through the surface in a disciplined order, can name the hidden process and predict its course. Now, go and find a dermatologist. A real one, working this week with a modern medical degree and a dermatoscope in her coat pocket. Ask her what she believes she is doing when she examines the surface of a patient from head to foot in a fixed order, looking at color and border and distribution and time of onset, and infers from those surface features a hidden internal process and a prognosis. She believes exactly the same thing. The surface is the readable index of the invisible interior. The naming is completely different, and I am not going to blur that for you. They named the invisible cause a god and put a hand on it. We name it a mutation in a specific gene, a pathogen with a genome we have sequenced, an autoimmune process in which the body's own defenses have misidentified a tissue. Those are not the same answers. They are not even the same kind of answer. One is theological and one is mechanistic, and no amount of soft talk makes them compatible. But the method is the same method. Read the surface in order. Infer the hidden cause. Predict the course. That is what they built in 40 tablets, and that is what a hospital does on a Tuesday morning. Let me hand the microphone to the skeptics, because they are owed it here more than anywhere else in this video. The Sakiku is not medicine as we understand medicine. The causal framework is theological through and through, and it is not a decorative wrapper on top of good empirical work. It is the actual explanatory engine, divine agency, offense, the hand of this god or that one. The prognoses are not derived from anything we would recognize as controlled observation. They are traditional, they are transmitted, and a great many of them are simply wrong. There is no mechanism in it. There is no anatomy in it in our sense. There is no test that could have shown a given entry to be false and got it deleted from the series. And the observations on the way to the house, the omens taken from the street, tell you plainly that this is a divinatory system that happens to be pointed at illness, not a proto-clinical science that happens to use religious vocabulary. All of that is right, every word of it. If you take nothing else from this section, do not walk away thinking Babylonian physicians were secretly modern. They were not. Their answers were wrong, and their framework was wrong. Their question was right. And here is the measurement. Alfred Blaschko, 1901. Blaschko was a dermatologist, and he did something that sounds almost boringly simple, and turned out to be one of the strangest findings about the human body that anyone has ever produced. He looked at patients with skin conditions that did not cover the skin evenly, conditions that came in streaks and patches and swirls, arranged in shapes on one part of the body and not another. And instead of treating each patient as a one-off, he collected them, large numbers of them, across many different conditions. And then he did the thing that turns observation into science. He transferred the pattern from each patient onto a drawing of a human figure, and he laid them over one another, and he looked for what they had in common. They were not random. They followed the same set of lines. Not similar lines, the same lines, patient after patient, across conditions that had nothing else in common with each other. Whorls on the abdomen, spiraling. V shapes across the back, pointing down along the line of the spine. Wavy, S-shaped lines over the sides of the chest. Long streaks running down the arms and the legs, straight along the limbs. A defined system of tracks, laid out over the whole surface of the human body, in the same arrangement on everybody. They are now called Blaschko's lines, and they have been on every dermatology curriculum for a century. Now the important part, and I want to be slow about this, because almost everyone who hears about these lines guesses wrong about what they are. They are not nerves. If you map the areas of skin served by the sensory nerves coming out of the spinal cord, you get a completely different pattern, a set of bands, and Blaschko's lines do not follow it. They are not blood vessels. They are not the lymphatic drainage. They are not muscle. They do not correspond to any structure you could dissect out of a body on a table. They are a record of movement. Specifically, they are the tracks along which cells traveled while you were an embryo. Here is the picture. Very early, you are a small number of cells. Then those cells divide, and their daughters divide, and the whole mass grows and stretches and folds itself into the shape of a body. As it grows, the descendants of any one early cell do not stay in a tidy clump. They spread. They migrate outward across the developing surface, following the growth of the tissue. And because the body is elongating in some places, and curving in others, and closing along a seam in others, the paths they take are not straight lines and not random scatter. They are curves, whorls where the tissue rotates, V shapes where two growing fronts meet at the back, streaks down the limbs, because the limbs grow outward like buds, and the cells get carried along the length. Blaschko's lines are that journey, frozen. Every one of those lines is the route that the family of one early cell took as it colonized its share of you. The map is not a map of anatomy. It is a map of history. It is the developmental record of who went where. And now land it, because this is the part that should keep you up. Those lines are on you, right now, tonight. Every square inch of your skin belongs to one migration track or another, and the whole system is laid out across you exactly as Blaschko drew it, from your scalp to your ankles. You cannot see them. And the reason you cannot see them is the beautiful part. You cannot see them because on a typical person, every one of those cell lineages looks the same as its neighbors. They all make the same amount of pigment. They all behave the same way. So the boundaries between them are invisible, in the way that the border between two fields of identical wheat is invisible. The lines are there. There is simply no contrast. They become visible only when one cell line differs from the ones beside it. And that takes you straight back to what I showed you earlier tonight, to the mosaicism, the fact that you are not one genome, you are a patchwork, because mutations arise in individual cells after conception, and every descendant of that cell inherits the difference. When one of those altered lineages is a pigment-making lineage, or a lineage that grows a little too fast, the difference develops a color. And the instant it has a color, it shows you its territory. Which is to say, it shows you its migration path. Which is to say, it draws one of Blaschko's lines on the outside of a living person. Invisible ink. That is why those swirls and streaks appear in patients, and not in you. Not because disease drew a pattern on them. The pattern was already there, on them, and on you, and on every human being who has ever lived. The disease only supplied the contrast. The map is not drawn by disease. The map is already there. Disease is only the ink. So here's where I leave you. and I want you to have the whole image at once. You are carrying a map. It was laid down before you were born, before you had a face, before there was anything about you that anyone could have named. It covers the entire surface of your body without a gap. It was drawn by the movement of cells that no longer exist as identifiable individuals, whose descendants are the skin you are touching right now, in a body that did not yet have a name, in a process you have no memory of, and no access to, and no authority over. It is the most complete record of your own history that exists anywhere, and you have never seen it, and in all likelihood, you will die without ever seeing it. Here I am, reaching past what any tablet says, and I will flag it out loud. No Babylonian knew about embryonic cell migration, and I am not claiming otherwise. What I am claiming is narrower, and I think harder to dismiss. They asserted that the surface of a body is a structured, non-random, readable record of an invisible process that produced it. That assertion is now measured. It has a name and a century of dermatology behind it. Their readings were wrong, and their gods were wrong. The premise held. So for the last time, look at yourself. Look at the skin of your abdomen, around and below the navel, and understand that you are looking directly at the whorls. They are right there, under your eyes, in the tissue you are looking at. You cannot see them, and that is not a failure of your eyesight, and it is not a trick. You cannot see them because nothing in you has ever gone differently enough, in that patch, to reveal the boundary. Your invisibility is a report of your own uniformity. The map is blank to you because the map came out even. They wrote it on the body, and it has not stopped being true. 12 of them. The series that turned a body into a text. The hand and its creases. The nail pressed into wet clay and the ridges that were fixed in you before you were born. The width of a face. The sound of a voice. The whirl at the crown of the head. The mark that came from nowhere, after conception, out of a mutation that arrived with no ancestor and no explanation. The blemish that closed a door. The star on the hand that said whose you were, and the map you will never see. They were wrong about the readings, almost every specific one. The mole did not mean wealth. The face did not predict the character. The blemish did not offend anything. Hand all of that to the skeptics and let them keep it, because they have earned it. They were right about the premise. The body is not a blank surface that things happen to. It is an inscribed record, written before you had a say in it, legible in principle, and every century that has looked at it seriously with better instruments than the last has found more writing on it, not less. That trend has not reversed once. Think about what it would mean if it never does. Because there is a question sitting underneath all 12 of these, and I have not answered it tonight, and I am not sure I can. If the body is a record, who is it a record for? A record implies a reader. Everything I have shown you was written down for someone to read, and we have spent this whole video being the readers. But the writing was there before we arrived, and that is the next one. The body is the oldest document you own, and you have never read it. Tell me in the comments what is on your left hand. Just that. I read them. Stay with me. The next one goes deeper.